Chapter 221, Ancient Terror. Ethan stared as the data streaked across his neural interface, a level 78 fossil pterodactyl. Nearby, elves clustered at levels 60 and 70. He frowned. The old man who'd just spoken couldn't be an ordinary player. He had to be at least a veteran Uranus class, and not a fresh recruit. Yet he looked every bit the harmless grandfather, dressed in a simple cardigan and slacks. Perhaps he didn't want to flaunt his strength. Ethan forced the readout to fade and shook his head. It wasn't the time to pick a fight with someone that powerful. Better to keep his distance and wait for an opening. Just then, Imamura Takuya returned, flanked by his two friends. Imamura slid 3 bank cards across the table toward Ethan. "Each of these has 1 million alliance coins," he said, voice strained into a forced casualness. "That's more than enough to cover the Jet Flame skill CD. I'm stepping out of the bidding. You can have this one untouched." His grin looked confident, but the tension around his eyes told a different story. Ethan picked up the cards and slipped them into his pocket. As the vendor prepared to start the auction, Ethan's mind raced, not just with the coin he now controlled, but with the unsettling realization that someone completely unassuming might be the deadliest competitor of them all. Ethan had promised his 2 fox allies and 2 dog allies generous rewards to secure the large loan of Union currency he needed. In fact, the total value of what he was offering far exceeded the money he'd received. Standing confidently before them, he sneered, "My brute here is worth more than the cash you're tossing my way. Don't go getting all high and mighty. This isn't a charity." Imamura Takuya gaped at him, dumbfounded. His face flushed crimson, and for a long moment he couldn't find a word. At last he stammered, "Very well. Let's settle this in the arena." A ripple of mockery ran through the onlookers. Without a word, Ethan turned and strode toward the public battlefield. One by one, curious spectators fell in behind him, until by the time he reached the sand-filled pit, they had nearly surrounded it. From a tall platform just outside the ring, the cruise ship referee surveyed the crowd. He stood ready, 2 flags in hand and a red whistle dangling from his neck, waiting for the signal to begin. Ethan stood across from Imamura Takuya as the referee finished laying out the rules. "Place your wagers," the official instructed, motioning to the polished mahogany chair between them. Imamura Takuya didn't hesitate. He produced 3 League secret bank cards, rare, highly prized tokens, and set them neatly to one side of the referee's seat. Ethan calmly placed the Super Ball, holding his captured, simple-minded beast on the other. The referee glanced at the creature, then nodded. "No objections?" "Very well." Ethan offered a confident grin. "None at all. Honestly, even a loss wouldn't strand him. If the match went south, the beast could activate its instant movement ability and teleport both Ethan and Imamura off the ship instantly. With a tame Tyrannosaurus serving as their unconventional transport at sea, they'd have little trouble returning to Deadleaf City, barring unforeseen complications. As for his reputation, Ethan barely gave it a thought. A little infamy from a lost bet was trivial. Alliances could be reshaped on a whim. Besides, after scanning Imamura's elven combat data, Ethan was convinced there was no way his opponent's fighting strength could rival his own. "Go on, Lakeview!" Takuya Imamura barked, tossing his Pokeball onto the battlefield. With a crackle of electricity, the light green rabbit-like Pokémon emerged. Name, Thunderhill. Species, light green, gender, female. Level 25, type electric, abilities, static. Held item, none. Innate moves, double slap, charge. Basic moves, tail whip, thundershock, screech, rain dance, thunderbolt, electroweb, quick attack, shadow ball, volt tackle. HM moves, rest, hyper beam. Imamura wasn't about to waste this moment. He'd specially arranged this match against Ethan to flaunt his new acquisition. He'd bought Lakeview only days ago and was eager to dominate. After all, nothing builds bragging rights like a crushing victory. What Imamura didn't realize was that Ethan already knew exactly which Pokémon he'd send out. Lakeview might be a final stage evolution at level 25, but its prior form as a Pikachu had never been allowed to reach peak potential. In fact, that forced evolution could easily have compromised its true strength. Now, as electric sparks danced across the arena floor, Imamura flashed a confident grin, and Ethan braced himself for what was sure to be a surprising first move. In its Pikachu form, Raichu is still raw, but some rookie trainers force evolution with an ordinary Thunderstone, hoping to gain an edge. In reality, that premature evolution doesn't increase battle power. It actually weakens the Pokemon's innate aptitude. Forced evolution is a serious setback to an elf's true potential. It's one of the main reasons Ethan refuses to let Dark Crow evolve. Dark Crow's hidden reserves haven't yet surfaced, and evolving him now would stunt his long-term growth. Shady elf dealers exploit this ignorance by buying these underdeveloped Pokemon at rock-bottom prices and reselling them to wealthy but inexperienced trainers who think they've snagged a bargain. Imamura Takuya is exactly that kind of buyer. Although he's officially a family trainer, he ranks low within his own household, perennially overshadowed by 3 older brothers. When he spotted a Raichu on sale for far less than its true value, he couldn't resist. In his mind, a fully evolved Raichu should cost only a few $100,000. So when Ethan noticed the Pokeball clipped to Takuya's belt, he didn't have to look any further to gauge the young trainer's real skill level. Ethan's Raichu, a once-abandoned Pokemon now fully evolved, stood quietly in the arena. His own skill at issuing commands was modest. He relied almost entirely on Raichu's raw power and the natural advantage of its electric typing. In the harsh world of Pokemon battling, cast-off survivors like this Raichu were too often seen as disposable tools. "Focus," Ethan murmured. "Meditate as soon as you hit the field." At the signal, Raichu bounded forward, then immediately closed its eyes and sank into serene meditation. The water type on the other side, a bulky, battle-worn beast, pranced about under the roar of the crowd. To most spectators, no matchup could be more lopsided. An evolved electric Pokemon should overwhelm a slow, water-type opponent without breaking a sweat. Even Ethan had braced for a tough fight. Yet as Raichu found its center and channeled its energy, a subtle shift rippled across the field. A quiet demonstration that discipline can be every bit as formidable as raw strength. Ethan watched in disbelief as the so-called foolish beast sank into a deep meditation instead of bracing for battle. A cruel smile curled on Imamura Takuya's lips as he turned to sneer at him. "Leikyu," he called out, voice proud and unforgiving, "give him 100,000 volts and finish him." A ripple of shock ran through the onlookers. Never before had Leikyu unleashed such raw, electrifying power so recklessly. Even now, the beast sat perfectly still, eyes closed, entirely absorbed in its trance. Its breath was slow and steady, an eerie calm in the eye of the storm, and it did not so much as flinch. As the crackling charge built between Leikyu's paws, Ethan steadied himself. He refused to show fear or mercy. He understood too well how desperation could cloud one's judgment, and how quickly mercy could become a fatal weakness. Chapter 222, Step on Face. Ethan watched Leikyu warily. Despite being an elf with the rare gift for storing and channeling electricity, Leikyu lacked real combat experience. Normally, an elf need only will the energy in their body to form a lightning strike in an instant, but Leikyu stood frozen, palms crackling as he struggled to gather his power. 3 long, tense seconds passed before he finally shaped a thunder sphere that crackled with 100,000 volts. On the other side of the clearing, Ethan's beast companion remained eerily still, its massive form humming with latent energy. Jade-green eyes half closed, it looked almost lost in meditation. That precious pause was all Leikyu needed. With a final exertion, the elf unleashed his lightning orb, sending jagged bolts arcing straight for the beast. Then, in a single heartbeat, the beast's eyes snapped open, now glowing electric blue. Lightning danced across its thick hide, yet it did not falter. Ethan's voice cut through the crackling air, calm but authoritative. "Hold your ground." At that command, the bond between trainer and beast flared into life. Muscles tensed and the beast planted its feet firmly. When Leikyu's thunderstrike hit, it met a solid wall of resistance. Sparks scattered harmlessly across the beast's hide and into the grass below. Leikyu staggered back, wide-eyed with shock. In that instant, Ethan and his beast moved as one, a silent testament to their unspoken understanding. The battlefield shifted in their favor. With the momentum now on their side, Ethan prepared to press the attack. Victory, he knew, was within his grasp. In Ethan's team, only Dark Crow and the Dull Beast were ready to attempt this advanced technique. Ghost Stone and Milk Tank were close behind, and Paula had only just begun to learn the basics. Then Leichu unleashed a massive thunderbolt, over 100,000 volts, directly at the dull beast's holding barrier. Ethan's command arrived at the last possible moment, just as the lightning strike was already on its way. And because lightning travels so fast, to most observers, it seemed the attack hit before the dull beast could even react. Boom! A cloud of dust erupted. An electric-type assault that powerful was devastating to a water-type creature. Even a perfectly matched opponent would be crippled after 2 such hits. Everyone watching feared the dull beast was finished. Imamura Takuya felt the same dread, but only for a heartbeat. As the dust settled and it became clear Leichu's bolt had broken through, Takuya's face lit up. Victory was his for the taking. If his dull beast now evolved into the coveted radiant dull beast, he would outshine all his rivals and secure his place as the family's heir. Ethan's pulse quickened with excitement. He lifted his chin and called out calmly, "Foolish beast, hit him with a psychic shock, then close in and crush him with a stomp." While the others still gaped, the creature sprang into action. Ethan's eyes glowed as he funneled invisible mental energy, laced with surging power, straight at Leichu's mind. The attack struck just as Leichu braced to retaliate. Suddenly, a searing pain gripped Leichu's skull, pinching his brain so fiercely that his vision wavered. Dizziness overtook him. Tamahata Imara noticed at once that something was wrong. He opened his mouth to shout orders, but the beast had already melted into the swirling dust. In the next heartbeat, the creature reappeared beside Leichu, teleporting in with terrifying speed. It reared up, hooves crackling with earthbound energy, then brought both down onto Leichu's face without a moment's hesitation. Boom! The ground fractured beneath them, jagged cracks racing outward. Under the beast's unstoppable weight, Leichu cried out as he was driven into the split earth. Ethan's summons of mental shock had frozen Leichu in place, but when he tried to press his advantage, his beast hesitated. It was the creature's first time using its new stomp skill, and it wasn't yet comfortable with it. After a moment's concentration, however, the ground atropar, Ibut energy beneath its paw, solidified into a glittering aura. Leichu, still dazed from the spirit assault, barely registered what was coming. With a thunderous stamp, the beast drove its hoof down across Leichu's cheek. The elf let out a strangled cry, but it did nothing to save him. Ethan gave a curt nod, and the beast reared up again, this time more confidently. Boom! Both hooves slammed into the same spot, cracking the rocky floor so deeply that Leichu collapsed into the fissure, unconscious and unable to continue the fight. Silence fell. The beast lifted its head and fixed Ethan with dark, expectant eyes, clearly asking if it should finish the job. Ethan shook his head. The moment didn't call for needless cruelty. He would not unleash another strike. Instead, he quietly signaled his companion to hold its power in reserve. Ethan's Pokémon had spent their lives battling in the wild, but today was their first official match. When they faced their opponents, the team led by Imamura Takuya, they'd been slow to respond, clearly unsettled by the stadium atmosphere. Then Ethan gave the signal. In an instant, his so-called dumb beasts shook off their daze. They lifted their heads and stared at the still stunned Imamura with unmistakable disdain, as if to say, You'd be our trainer? With one graceful, almost mocking step forward, Ethan's lead Pokémon snatched the Pokéball, and just as boldly, the 3 secret League Pass cards, right off the referee's stand. Within seconds, it delivered them into Ethan's waiting hand. There was a stunned silence. Then the referees, finally recovering their composure, hoisted Ethan's flag and announced, "Victory to Ethan and his Pokémon." A wave of astonished chatter rippled through the stands. Everyone was trying to process what had just happened. Ethan's wild-bred team had defeated Leichu's carefully trained squad in under 10 seconds. It was faster and more decisive than anyone had dared imagine. Leichu's Pokémon were famed for their disciplined, methodical style. How had they been dismantled so completely, so effortlessly? That question burned in every trainer's mind as Ethan stepped forward to claim his prize. Few people understood exactly why Leichu had suffered such a crushing defeat. There were 2 key reasons. First, these so-called simple beasts truly outclassed him. In both combat savvy and raw physical strength, they had the edge. Second, they'd learned the ground-type move Stomp, which deals double damage against electric-type spirits like Leichu. Ethan had anticipated that his water and super-type creatures would one day face electric opponents, so he'd made sure they picked up Stomp as a countermeasure. Since they'd only just mastered the technique, their control wasn't perfect yet. To guarantee success, Ethan instructed each beast to deliver 2 consecutive stomps. That extra strike ensured Lakeview wouldn't recover in time to turn the battle back in his favor. Ethan's orders had been simple: send the lumbering beast in to deliver a stomp. By the time Lakeview finished, he'd already recovered every ounce of his fighting prowess. When the creature finally presented the elven orb and the bank card, Ethan met Takuya Imamura's stunned glare with utter calm, slipping both prizes neatly into his pocket. Under his breath, he couldn't help but smile. This fool's money was absurdly easy to claim. A few more opportunities like this wouldn't go amiss. And yet, in the aftermath of their clash, he was certain the vanquished would soothe their bruised egos with all manner of wishful thinking. 3rd installment coming soon. Thank you for your support of Dark Rise of the Elves. Chapter 223, Ring Race. Pa pa pa. A fresh round of applause broke out among the spectators. Who's that? Takuya Imamura's eyes snapped open at the sudden clapping. He swept his gaze across the stands, searching for the source. He'd been prepared for this match. If by some quirk of fate he lost, he'd need to uncover Ethan's true identity once he returned backstage. Ethan claimed to be a family trainer, but Imamura's own house in Kuba City was only a modest medium-sized clan. He didn't intend to bow to some unknown novice. Ethan, however, paid him no mind. From his understated attire and unassuming bearing, it was clear he wasn't backed by any of the established powers. His lineage sprang from a minor house that had vanished long ago, obliterated in his previous life, so nobody in this world recognized the name. That suited Ethan perfectly. Imamura, for his part, had no recollection of the clan and saw no reason to treat him as anything more than an insignificant upstart. If the boy's disappearance offended Ethan's family, so be it. Imamura planned to demonstrate just how weak those roots were by defeating Ethan here and now. Besides, he'd be heading to Fungyuan territory next. The small families of Kanto held no sway there. If they followed, he'd simply cut them down as he saw fit. Perhaps he should review his old assassination techniques. They had grown a bit rusty over time. The applause faded. The crowd slowly parted, eyes fixed on the 2 fighters in the ring. Something told Imamura this wouldn't be the easy victory he'd expected. Ethan stepped back as the doors opened to reveal a portly, elderly gentleman in a black tuxedo. Perched on his nose were a pair of small, round spectacles, their thin silver chains looping over his ears to rest at the back of his collar. Wispy gray beard sprouted at his temples, framing his face like peculiar sideburns. 2 impeccably dressed sons-in-law escorted him on either side, supporting him with discreet deference. If not for their formal attire and the crowd's hushed reverence, he might have passed for the kindly uncle next door. Imamura Takuya, standing nearby, felt his spine stiffen the instant the man appeared. Any flicker of anger he'd harbored just moments before drained away, replaced by an instinctive urge to shrink back. Yet the old gentleman paid him no mind. His sharp gaze swept the gathering with a gentle smile. "Master Yamamoto," voices rang out almost in unison. "Master Yamamoto," echoed down the polished hall. All around, heads bowed deeply, their tones brimming with respect. Master Yamamoto inclined his head in acknowledgement, clearly pleased by the chorus of honorifics. Ethan watched them with growing curiosity. Had they called his name? He glanced from one bowed figure to the next, then back to the old man, only to realize the crowd's deference was reserved entirely for Yamamoto. Clearing his throat, Ethan offered the gentleman a respectful nod. Though he kept his expression neutral, in his heart he shared the crowd's reverence for the man before him. Ethan watched as the burly man named Yamamoto stroked his graying beard and smiled. "Your younger brother certainly has remarkable strength," Yamamoto said. "He even sailed the St. Teanu out of Yamato Harbor all by himself." Ethan's eyes narrowed. The Yamamoto clan wasn't one of the Kanto families he knew. None of those small houses could have leased a vessel like the St. Teanu. He forced a respectful bow. "Mr. Yamamoto, I wish I could be of service, but I'm not sure how I can help." He reminded himself that offending a house rich enough to charter the St. Teanu would be a grave mistake. no matter how insignificant they might seem compared to Yamamoto's family. At Ethan's deferential tone, Yamamoto and his companion, Dale, suddenly broke into laughter. Yamamoto waved a hand dismissively. "Oh please, no need for formalities. I simply enjoy watching elf battles. Unfortunate for me, though, I have neither the talent nor the call to be a trainer." Yamamoto glanced over at Takuya Imamura, who was edging away with sweat beading on his forehead and hastily bowing. A flicker of contempt crossed Yamamoto's eyes, but he seemed to think little of the small Imamura clan. He turned back to Ethan with that same easy grin. "Now, shall we find a match?" Ethan didn't hesitate to get his own hands dirty when dealing with rival families. As Mr. Yamamoto finished speaking, Ethan's eyes flickered ever so slightly. He glanced at the two elegantly dressed girls standing beside him. Did the old man really have no better pastimes? He kept silent, merely nodding in response. Mr. Yamamoto cleared his throat and continued, "All right, since we have some time before we reach the next port, I've decided to hold an elven skirmish aboard the Sante Anu. It won't delay our arrival, and it should be entertaining." He paused, surveying the assembled guests. "Naturally, a competition needs prizes, so I've provisionally set the grand rewards as 3 rare skill CDs: Frozen Light, Quick Freezing Light, Earthquake, and Tidal Surge." As he spoke, Yamamoto cast a curious glance at Ethan's companion beast. Ethan felt a brief twinge of surprise, but swiftly regained his composure. Those exact 3 skills were ones only his creature could learn. Was that merely coincidence, or had Yamamoto planned this all along? Mr. Yamamoto chuckled. "Of course, there will be additional rewards. My secretary will iron out the specifics and announce them shortly." With that, the stage was set, an impromptu tournament promising both glory and rare treasures, and whatever hidden motives lay behind Mr. Yamamoto's knowing smirk. But no matter the outcome, every participant will receive at least a 5,000 Union coin consolation prize, Yamamoto announced, his voice booming over the crowd. "So I expect to see plenty of eager sign-ups." He leaned forward, stroking the neatly trimmed beard at his chin. "Frankly, I find the usual battle format a bit predictable, and it isn't always fair to mid-level trainers. That's why I've come up with a new ring tournament system. Details to follow from my secretary." Ethan felt Yamamoto's gaze sweep over him and his creature companion. The look was peculiar, curious perhaps, but not hostile, and left him oddly unsettled. Having delivered his speech, Yamamoto accepted help from 2 attendants. Though he seemed hale and hearty, he still needed their support as he made his way off stage. The 2 young women guiding him looked far more than mere assistants. There was a quiet confidence in their step that spoke volumes. As soon as clan leader Yamamoto slipped out of sight, a collective sigh of relief rose among the onlookers. Whether they were official trainers or civilians, everyone stood on guard. No one wanted to risk crossing a figure of his influence. Imamura Takuya, in particular, was still shaking from the encounter. He'd been moments from panic, and thought less of seeking revenge on Ethan than of the impression he'd made on Yamamoto. Would the clan leader now think poorly of him? Truth be told, with Yamamoto's standing, there was no need for him to personally handle a minor house like the Imamuras. A few offhand complaints to the right people would be more than enough to see that the Imamura family fell out of favor. Plenty of rivals would leap at the chance to curry favor with the Yamamotos and reduce the Imamuras to ruin. None of the others guessed at Takuya's inner turmoil, though. All around, hushed discussions grew more animated, half of them debating Yamamoto's next move, the other half eager to sign up for his famed elf challenge. After all, any trainer who entered would receive 5,000 alliance coins just for participating. "I'd be happy to polish this chapter for you, but I'll need the full text you'd like revised. The few lines you've posted aren't enough to retain all the plot points, characters, and details you mentioned. Could you please paste the entire chapter or a larger excerpt here? That way I can deliver a coherent, fluid English version with Ethan as the male protagonist." Chapter 224, Disaster. While the others flaunted their power, Ethan slipped away from the crowd, leading a sluggish, dumb beast by its harness. He tapped open his phone and brought up the official announcement for the upcoming ring tournament. The grand prize was almost too tempting to resist. First place awarded 3 rare skill discs: Frozen Bond, Earthquake, and Tidal Surge, each as valuable as the famed jet flame disc. Altogether, their combined worth easily exceeded 500,000 credits, possibly far more once you factored in their unique effects. On top of that, simply signing up earned every contestant 5,000 affiliate coins, a commitment by the organizers that pushed the total prize pool to nearly 1,000,000 credits. Second and third place, along with numerous consolation rewards, only added to the bounty. Yet Ethan remained unshaken. Soon they would board the chartered cruise liner Santiano and confront hordes of mindless beasts. He'd faced tougher challenges before. With steady resolve, he made his way back to his cabin, fully intending to compete for that top spot. After all, once they reached Sing City, everyone would be training against those same beasts anyway, so why not get a head start now? Ethan didn't know the exact rules of the tournament yet, so all he could do was wait patiently. He released the rest of his summoned elves from the containment sphere. After so long on the field, they'd grown restless, especially the scorpion-tailed scorpion. Its body had already swelled to the size of 3 basketballs, and Ethan estimated that after another growth cycle, it would reach full maturity. Takuya Imamura didn't strike Ethan as a serious threat, but there were others in the crowd whose presence made him uneasy. He refused to delude himself into thinking victory was a certainty. This was a regulated competition. Many of his unorthodox tactics were off-limits. In a no-rules skirmish, he might have handled most of the ship's passengers, even those with more powerful spirits, without breaking a sweat. But that hulking old man he'd glimpsed earlier? Now that was someone he couldn't afford to underestimate. Ethan knew that a warrior of his caliber, unleashing even a single elf, could overwhelm an entire ship's crew in moments. But since they still had to wait for the official rules to be announced, he refused to let his team idle away their time. He gathered his elves and led them to the indoor training hall. Each of his elves had just acquired new skills, and every one of them needed practice. The hall's floor was reinforced metal, nothing like the jagged, rocky ground of their previous battlefield. Ethan tested it himself, running his clawed gauntlet across the surface. Not even a scratch remained. Confident that this arena could withstand any fury they unleashed, he gave the word, "Begin." One of the key abilities they were honing was provocation, the art of taunting foes to draw their focus. Dark Crow knew the technique in theory, but had never practiced teaching it. Likewise, Ghost Stone and Clawtail Scorpion had learned provocation, yet struggled to pass on its finer points. Fortunately, Paula had recently mastered it at a basic level. She wasn't yet a virtuoso, but she grasped the fundamentals well enough to guide the Dark Crows through their drills. Ethan pulled Paula aside. "You'll lead provocation training," he said. "Help them iron out any kinks and answer their questions." Paula nodded eagerly, stepping forward to marshal the Dark Crows into formation. With clear instructions from their temporary instructor and the indestructible floor beneath them, Ethan watched his team launch into coordinated practice. Knowing that, rules or no rules, every moment spent refining their skills brought them closer to victory. Ethan's new ground-type recruit had only one skill in its repertoire so far, Stomp. None of the other team members could use it, so the beast would have to learn its full potential on its own. Fortunately, Ethan was already familiar with Stomp's mechanics. After studying its effects and demonstrating the move once, he set the beast to solo practice. He'd explained that Stomp is an area of effect attack. A single, earth-shaking stomp radiates damage to all foes within range and temporarily slows their movement. That made it a perfect counter to the electric-type elves, against whom the team had few other options. At the same time, Ghost Stone had unlocked 2 new poison-based techniques, Poisonous Cloud and Poison Strike. Both attacks drew on the creature's internal toxic energy, so as soon as Ghost Stone learned them, Ethan ordered non-stop drills until the moves were flawless. To speed up Ghost Stone's progress even further, Ethan had the beast create a supercharged energy shield around it. The shield let Ghost Stone safely absorb twice its normal quota of poisonous gas, dramatically accelerating its mastery of those skills. By the end of the training period, the beast's stomp had grown far more potent and precise, and Ghost Stone was effortlessly channeling its poison techniques. With these new tools at their disposal, Ethan's team was now better equipped than ever to face the electric-type elves, and whatever other dangers lay ahead. Ethan was confident they'd absorb the energy in no time, and once they did, they'd stabilize at the light scion rank. He still didn't know how many elf opponents they might face in the ring, so he wanted every one of his elves on full alert. Sure, using summoned beasts was one strategy, and slipping an elf into the audience as a spy wouldn't hurt. But whether his milk tank elf fought or not, her combat skills still needed sharpening. Milk Tank had only just learned the tile breaker technique. To help her master it, Paula had been working with her on a paired drill, Milk Tank delivering powerful overhead strikes to the training dummy's upper plate, while Paula's low kicks targeted its base. Their attacks meshed seamlessly, each correction sharpening the other's form. Meanwhile, Scorpius, the scorpion-tailed assassin, remained focused on his signature moves. Although he'd only entered his accelerated growth phase a few days ago, his body had already bulked up, and he'd absorbed a host of basic skills. So alongside his daily physical conditioning, he drilled those fundamentals relentlessly, determined to make every move second nature. Once he'd laid out the training rotations for all his elves, Ethan settled onto the floor in a cross-legged lotus stance. It was time for his own cultivation session, time to unlock the next surge of his superpower. The chamber fell silent, but for the soft hum of mana as Ethan closed his eyes, centering himself for what came next. Ethan only realized something was wrong when he sat down and his right eyelid began to twitch uncontrollably. He frowned. An old earth superstition ran through his mind. Twitching the left eyelid meant good luck, but twitching the right spelled trouble. He'd always dismissed it as nonsense, yet now an inexplicable chill ran down his spine. Since manifesting his newfound powers, Ethan's control over them had been rudimentary at best. Still, along with raw strength and speed, he'd gained something else, a keen, almost animalistic intuition. Back when he'd lived off the land, he'd learned to trust his gut more readily than any hard evidence. Sometimes a silent warning was the only guide he had, but ever since his transformation, that instinct had lain mostly dormant, until today. As he prepared to begin his next training session, the twitch in his right eye felt less like a muscle spasm and more like an alarm bell. His heart pounded, his palms growing slick with sweat despite the cool air of the training hall. Around him, other students moved into position, oblivious to the warning reverberating through his body. Ethan took a steadying breath, forcing himself to calm the turmoil inside. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. This twitch was a sign he couldn't ignore. Something bad was coming, and he needed to be ready. Ethan shook his head, determined to sweep away the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. No matter what might come, there was nothing he could do until the moment arrived. He was still out on the open sea, stranded aboard this vessel, unable to leave even if he wished. All he could do now was steady his heart and prepare. He closed his eyes and sank into meditation, letting the gentle roll of the ship and the endless horizon calm him. Minutes stretched into hours as he wrestled silently with his worries, until finally he rose and reached for his journal. By lantern light, Ethan poured his thoughts onto the page. Yet the more he wrote, the more tangled his ideas became, each line breeding new questions. Frustration pricked at him, the sense that he wasn't yet ready to face what lay ahead. He snapped the notebook shut. With the first light of dawn, when the ship turned homeward from this unexpected detour, he vowed he would rise early. He would sort through every fear and every plan, dissecting them until his path was clear. This was only the beginning, the dark rise of the elves. Chapter 225, Creepy Ethan slipped into meditation, but barely a moment later, he startled awake. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the sterile walls of the training chamber. "What's going on?" he murmured, rubbing his eyes. The usual calm of his meditative state had been cut short. Determined to understand, he closed his eyes again, and this time he sank into meditation almost instantly. He lost track of time then. 5 minutes later, his eyes flew open. To his surprise, a quiet excitement shone in them. So that's the effect of deep meditation, he thought, glancing around. But the superpower training manual never mentioned this. Ethan paced the chamber, puzzling over his experience. Before today, his meditation progress had felt linear, steady but slow. Now it had accelerated, as if his internal clock had tripled in speed. He didn't know whether this was a unique quirk of his modest superpower base or a universal benefit of entering a truly deep meditative state. He tapped the side of his wrist, bringing up the readout on the data chip implanted beneath his skin. A faint blue glow traced circuits along his veins. "Chip," he said, voice low, "explain the changes in my physiology. What just happened?" A moment later, the chip's synthesized voice answered, cool and precise. "Analyzing. Data indicates a 300% increase in neural processing efficiency and metabolic regulation during deep meditation protocols. No precedent found in standard training archives." Ethan's lips curved into a small grin. The discovery felt as eerie as it was thrilling, but he had questions, and only the chip held the answers. "Beep. Your brainwave activity is now 3 times higher than before, and it's holding at this level. At this rate, your superpower training speed has tripled," the chip announced. A holographic chart flickered to life in front of Ethan, split into 2 halves. On the left, his brainwave readings before meditation. On the right, the readings after he entered a deep trance. The difference was stark. His cerebral activity had indeed shot up 3-fold. Below the chart, another line of data blinked urgently. Estimated time to reach junior superhuman level, 10 years. Ethan's pulse quickened. Tripling his cultivation speed was unbelievable, but his raw talent was so weak that even this boost would barely lift him out of the lowest tier. Still, it was something. Hope at last. At 15 years old, he had a decade ahead of him. By 25, he'd still be young for a professional superpower trainer, and by then he'd have full access to the ECG interface. A small smile tugged at his lips. Renewed confidence surged through him. Without hesitation, Ethan closed his eyes and sank back into meditation. After 3 hours of quiet anticipation, the ship's speakers chimed, and every video screen aboard the Santa Anu flickered to life. The secretary to organizer Yamato Yamamoto stepped into view and began detailing the competition's rules and prizes. Throughout the cruise liner, the information looped continuously, reminding every guest that this was no ordinary tournament. Ethan sat on the edge of his berth in his stateroom, eyes glued to the enormous monitor before him. A gleaming list of rewards scrolled across the top. First place, Skill CD unlocking Freeze Light, Quake, and Surf. Second place, Skill CD for Jetfire. Third place, 300,000 Union Coins. Fourth, 8th place, prizes ranging from 50,000 Union Coins up to nearly 4 million in total value across all awards. Yamamoto's generosity was unmistakable. Every top 8 finisher would walk away with at least 50,000 Union Coins. And to ensure no competitor held back for fear of injury, the Santa Anu's elf infirmary had been thrown open. All treatments and healing services were free of charge. "We want to see fierce battles," the secretary's calm voice echoed. On the screens below, the full set of competition rules began to scroll, outlining everything from match procedures to scoring guidelines. Ethan leaned forward, heart pounding. The stage was set, and he was more determined than ever to claim one of those life-changing prizes. With dozens of trainers signed up, each with vastly different skill levels, it would be pointless to have a champion-caliber trainer spend hours battling a novice. To streamline things, the tournament is split into 2 stages, the preliminaries and the main event. In the opening round of the preliminaries, all registered trainers are placed into 8 pools by random draw. Each pool competes simultaneously across the 8 arenas aboard the St. Anu, and only the top 2 finishers from each arena advance, filling out the Sweet 16. Because the pairings are random, some arenas end up stacked with several powerful contenders, while others see mostly underdogs, sometimes knocking out a favorite early on. Those who lose in this first round aren't eliminated outright. Instead, they drop into the loser's bracket, where they face off for a second chance. Out of that repechage, 4 trainers earn wild card spots and rejoin the main bracket of 16. This format keeps the tournament exciting and gives even an early defeat a silver lining. Ethan leaned back in his chair and reviewed the tournament rules one more time. The Elite 16 challenge was simple but fiercely competitive. Only the top 16 trainers aboard the ship would make it into the main draw. Any challenger who defeated one of the current 16 would take their place. At the start of the competition, Each trainer would register up to 3 elves. A random draw would then pair them off for the preliminary round, where only 1 elf per trainer could fight in each match. In the arena, elves battled until one side was knocked out or 2 injured to continue. Defeated trainers earned a consolation prize of 5,000 union coins just for showing up. Those who won at least one bout but fell short of the quarterfinals were awarded 20,000 union coins. From there, the rewards only increased with each advancing round. On the whole, the system struck Ethan as fair, and the prizes were generous enough to tempt almost any trainer on board. He expected a full roster of applicants. Of course, for the very best, those whose skills and powerful elves put them head and shoulders above the competition. This kind of purse might be little more than pocket change. Take Ethan himself, for instance. He disguised himself as an unassuming old man, but in truth he was likely the strongest trainer on the ship. To someone of his caliber, a few dozen thousand union coins hardly counted as motivation. He was in it for the challenge, and nothing else. Ethan didn't actually have to compete. After all, Mr. Yamamoto was wealthy enough to charter a cruise ship like the Sante Anu, and he wouldn't be sailing without his elite bodyguards in tow. Once the heavyweight contenders boarded, there'd be no need for lengthy preliminaries or head-to-head comparisons. The outcome would be settled quickly and decisively. Ethan was certainly one of those contenders, but for his own reasons, he decided against entering the tournament itself. Still, the registration window closed at midnight, and anyone wishing to compete simply had to call the front desk from their stateroom phone. Since every passenger's details were logged when they purchased their ferry ticket, the staff could verify sign-ups by cabin number in an instant. Ethan paused for a moment, then picked up the phone. He gave the clerk a name, and within seconds his registration was confirmed. The preliminary round would begin the following morning. Everything had been arranged with astonishing speed, almost as if the entire event had been planned far in advance. No sooner had Mr. Yamamoto announced that the Taiwan leg of the tournament would take place aboard the Sante Anu than the ship's crew sprang into action. Departments coordinated seamlessly, transforming the vessel into a floating arena. By late afternoon, every detail was in place, and the competition was ready to begin. The official match begins tomorrow. The more Ethan thought about it, the more a small knot of unease formed in his gut. Everything was moving far too quickly, far too smoothly, so smoothly that it felt downright eerie. Congratulations to Henry FFF for stepping in as lead author of this volume. Hibiscus still owes us 5 more chapters. Hard Code, Roar, The Elves, Dark Ascension, Chapter 226, Fire Department 3. Early the next morning, once Ethan and his elves had wrapped up their morning drills, they heeded the ship's broadcast and made their way to the largest open area on the deck. Before them lay 16 battle arenas and 16 practice grounds, each open to public use free of charge with only a small deposit held against any accidental damage. Only if equipment was harmed would the deposit be forfeited. By the time Ethan arrived, the grounds were already buzzing with activity. Not just professional trainers, but many ordinary passengers had gathered too. After all, the Sante Anu might be a luxury cruise tailored for elf trainers, but it welcomed families and even sold tickets to non-trainers. More people meant a livelier atmosphere, and more revenue for the cruise line. Ethan's elf Chingmu stood quietly at his side, surveying the growing crowd with calm detachment. It wouldn't be long before the matches began. All around them, trainers were pacing beside their own elves, checking gear, running final scans. Ethan tapped his chip once more. Every elf in range registered clearly. The stage was set. Most of the participating elves were only around level 10 or 12. A few had recently cracked into the low 20s, levels 21 and 22 at most, but none were true powerhouses. Their individual talent grades hovered around yellow or light yellow, with only the rarest specimens reaching light green. In short, the overall field was fairly modest. As the crowd settled, one of the referees strode onto the pre-built arena. Without much fanfare, he ran through the rules one last time and then formally announced the start of the tournament. Behind him, 8 large screens flickered to life, each displaying a list of registered trainers and the names of their assigned battlefields. Ethan watched as a team of staffers finished uploading the final data into the central computer. In moments, every competitor had been randomly assigned to one of the 8 venues. He leaned forward, scanning the names on screen 7. His own assignment flashed in bright white letters. Altogether, there were just over 200 contestants, split evenly among 8 arenas. That worked out to roughly 30 or 40 trainers per venue, and only the top 2 from each site would advance to the next round. With 56 hopefuls already eliminated here, the odds were steep. Ethan let out a slow breath and tucked his hands into his jacket pockets. Venue 7 wasn't the toughest, but it wouldn't be a cakewalk either. He squared his shoulders, lifted his chin, and headed for the entrance gate. His mind was already racing through strategies. He had no intention of becoming one of the dozens left behind today. Ethan stepped onto the field, his companion, a hulking, lumbering beast, trailing behind him. Dozens of trainers and spectators turned to watch his arrival. He caught the glint of wary hostility in their eyes. They remembered yesterday's match between Ethan and Imamura Takuya, a one-sided defeat that had convinced them Ethan was no threat. Now, learning that he'd be competing alongside them, they couldn't hide their scorn. Ethan offered a small, polite smile. Let them sneer. This was the usual grumbling of the insecure. He took his place at the marker, adjusting the strap on his glove. Before he could settle, a young man of about his own age stepped forward. His expression was open and friendly rather than confrontational. "Hey there," the newcomer said, grinning. "You must be the trainer who had that, Thunderstrike move yesterday, right?" He gestured toward Ethan's beast. "I didn't get to see the match, but imagine my luck ending up on the same field as you today." Ethan raised an eyebrow but remained silent, sizing him up. The other boy laughed, undeterred. "No offense. I've heard good things about your team. I'm Kai, by the way. I guess we're partners for this round?" At that, Ethan nodded. "Ethan." His tone was cool but not unfriendly. Kai clapped him on the shoulder. "Great. I'll be counting on you. Let's show everyone what we've got." As they took their positions, Ethan felt a spark of anticipation. Today, he wasn't here to prove himself to doubters. He was here to win. And with Kai at his side, he had a real chance. Chapter X, Only the Two of Us. With the qualifying slots for this arena now decided, only 2 of us remain. Just you and me. Ethan's eyes flickered. He took a measured step backward, putting more space between himself and the young man he had once considered a comrade. The youth, however, either didn't notice the slight rudeness or simply didn't care. He lunged forward again, only to collide headfirst with an invisible barrier. "Ow, what the heck?" the boy yelped, rubbing his forehead. Ethan frowned. "What are you doing?" The youth straightened, smirking through the pain. "Look, there's no question that we 2 combined are the strongest contenders here. Why not form an alliance and sweep the rest of them aside? Your power's the only one I can't predict. Everyone else is garbage." He tossed his head disdainfully at the surrounding competitors. At that moment, Ethan's eyes drifted to the elves standing beside him. Their silent presence caught him off guard, and his pupils narrowed. He hadn't even noticed them before. Silence stretched between Ethan and the other boy as the weight of the proposal hung in the air. The arena's crowd watched, breathless, knowing the final showdown was about to begin, either as rivals or as unexpected allies. Ethan had barely registered his surroundings when he realized the strange creature standing next to him was no ordinary Pokémon. It was the Kanto region's fire dinosaur, one of the famed fire-type royal trio. A quick glance at his Pokédex confirmed the truth. Species fire dinosaur, nickname Little Fire Dragon, gender level 25, type fire, characteristic fierce heart, held item none, base moves bite, dragon wave, metal claw, learned moves leer, screech, ember, smoke screen, dragon rage, shadow sneak, TMHM moves, thunder punch, fire punch, potential moves, flamethrower, brick break, rock slide, body slam. It was Ethan's first up-close encounter with one of Kanto's royal fire Pokémon. Of all 3 members of the so-called royal trio, he believed this little fire dragon possessed the greatest raw potential, provided it met the same training standards as its counterparts. After all, the line to which it belonged could mega-evolve twice. Though officially classified as fire-flying, the creature carried enough draconic blood to master true dragon-type techniques. All right, Ethan said, nodding to himself. He'd heard that only trainers of Alliance lineage ever managed to bond with a royal Pokémon. Now that he had one by his side, he knew the real journey was only beginning. Ethan stood on the edge of the clearing, his gaze sweeping over friend and foe alike. Even at his age, it was obvious he belonged among the Alliance's most promising champions, and his elven allies were no slouches in battle. Together, they had the strength to sweep every rival from this field. A man with a silver hairpin caught Ethan's eye. At Ethan's firm nod, the stranger hesitated for a heartbeat, then threw back his head and laughed. "Ha ha ha! I knew you had the sight. With our powers combined, water and fire, we'll flatten this arena in no time." Ethan studied him, guessing at his true intentions. If the man hoped for easy access to Ethan's strength, he'd find the illusion of simplicity just as hard to shatter as any barrier. Before Ethan could speak, the stranger reached out and tousled his hair. "Right, I never introduced myself. Name's Jita, from Changpan in Kanto. This is my first campaign." He stretched out a hand, eyes bright with sincerity. To Jite, Ethan's swift agreement signified trust in both his skill and his honor. And so, confident in that shared faith, Jai laid bare his identity and sealed their new alliance. Ethan held out his hand, gave the other man's a firm shake, and said with a cool smile, "I'm Ethan." Suddenly, the in-game interface erupted with notifications. Second round now open. Submit any request. Monthly passes, recommended tickets, subscriptions, favorites, and don't forget to send rewards. The rising darkness of the Elves event has begun. Chapter 227, Drawing Out Hatred. Kit bounded forward, thrilled after shaking hands with Ethan, and before Ethan could react, Kit threw his arms around him in a big hug. But Ethan stepped back at the last second, stumbled, and collided with a shimmering barrier, a wall of energy created by one of the other trainer's powerful creatures. Kit froze, his face falling as he glanced at his own creature in disbelief. Then he looked back at Ethan, who stood there perfectly calm, as if he'd never been about to embrace him in the first place. Kit's heart sank. He'd actually believed that this might be the start of something legendary, and now there was no time to dwell on it. The other contestants had already taken their places, and the referee signaled that everyone's creatures should head onto the battlefield. The arena was a jagged expanse of rocks and cliffs, neutral ground with no clear advantage for any trainer. Once the barrier at the entrance faded, the creatures poured in, all eyes narrowing as they sized each other up. Only the handful of trainers who'd met beforehand had their monsters grouped together. Everyone else scattered, forming uneasy alliances or staking out rivals to eliminate. Ethan and Kit fell in with one of those makeshift alliances. Ethan gave a quiet command, and his fire dinosaur stomped forward, roaring its challenge and marking the enemy's position. Instantly, dozens of trainers glanced over, eager to be the first to strike Ethan's formidable beast. The tension in the arena spiked. This battle was about to become much more than a simple contest of strength. Despite knowing how formidable Ethan's brute was, a handful of elves had plotted to gang up on it, only to be shocked when an equally mighty fire drake appeared at its side. The brute cast a glance at its fiery companion, then turned toward Ethan. When Ethan gave a curt nod, the brute wrestled down its instinct to unleash a full-strength water jet. It had been by Ethan's side for so long that only Ethan's own elves were ever allowed this close. This was the first time any stranger's beast had approached so near, and in the heat of the moment, it almost reacted on instinct. The referee's whistle blew, and chaos erupted across the field. "Brute, hold!" Ethan commanded, his voice cutting clearly through the clamor. "Ethan, what's the plan? Do we attack together?" Gith called from beside him, his earlier injury, once hidden beneath a crude bandage, now healed. He wore a cold, determined expression, ready for battle. "Not yet," Ethan replied. "We go half strength on my mark, then unleash full power." "Understood," Gith answered. No sooner had Ethan spoken than the fire drake thundered forward, roaring as it collided with the rival elves already engaged in combat. The battle was joined. Ethan's beasts unleashed a flurry of abilities in perfect sync. Standing beside him, Kai and Kit calmly called out each command, so quietly that an outsider might have missed them, but the fire drake caught every nuance and reacted flawlessly. Ethan felt that familiar surge of adrenaline, the slight tremor in his spine he could never quite master. "Foolish beasts, forward," he ordered. "Flash step, then stamp of might. Hurl them away." A thunderous roar answered him. In a blink, the foolish beasts vanished and reappeared among the elven fighters, slamming into their ranks. Though they'd only been training a day, their newly learned stamp of might struck with devastating force. The elves and their trainers froze in astonishment. No one had expected Ethan's supposedly weak minions to break the formation, let alone interrupt the duel groups. Almost without thinking, the elves abandoned their original opponents and redirected their attacks toward the intruders. But the foolish beasts didn't flinch. Ignoring arrows and jabs, they pressed on with relentless determination, shoving aside every elf who crossed their path, and proving, in that instant, that under Ethan's command, even the humblest creatures could become a force to be reckoned with. Energized power colas set at the tips of the beast's two cloven hooves, then slammed into the earth with a deafening crack. Jagged fissures snaked outward, shredding the rocky surface. The elven vanguard, mid-assault, staggered as their carefully timed advance dissolved into chaos. Their graceful forms wavered, yet the simple-minded creatures pressed on undeterred. For a heartbeat, Ethan stood motionless, eyes closed in deep focus. Then, as if unleashing a coiled spring, he poured every ounce of his mental discipline into the field. Silvery runes blossomed across the dirt in perfect arcs, each glyph humming with latent energy, until, one by one, they detonated in invisible shockwaves. Elven warriors were swept off their feet and hurled clear out of the arena. Their trainers, helpless to counter, could only gape at the unexpected display of force. Though bewildered, they recognized immediately who was responsible: Ethan's primitive fire dinosaur. Miraculously, no elf suffered injury. The shockwaves merely expelled them beyond the boundaries, eliminating them from the round. Some trainers narrowed their eyes in annoyance, but others, admittedly impressed, nodded in reluctant respect. "Perfect," called Git, a lanky young trainer known for his boisterous grin. "Just the kind of show I like. Fire Dragon, let's turn up the heat." With a triumphant roar, the crimson-scaled dinosaur pawed the ground, its eyes blazing with fresh ferocity as it surged forward toward its next adversary. Ethan watched confidently as his summoned beast thundered onto the field. He'd issued his commands and now leaned back, letting the creature, branded by spectators as the mindless beast, handle the fight. His attention, however, never strayed far from Git's fire dinosaur as it lumbered into position. The fire dinosaur's attacks were deceptively simple, but brutally effective. Whether unleashing a scorching breath to send an opponent flying or slamming its blazing tail to clear the ground, each strike was precise, brutal, and immaculately timed. There were small flaws in its technique, an overzealous roar here, a delayed tail swipe there, but none that mattered in the heat of battle. A group of about 20 elves, buoyed by bravado, tried to gang up on the beast and the dinosaur. They had seen the pair in yesterday's duel, when the mindless beast famously defeated Takuya Imamura, and figured they could tip the scales by working together. In reality, these elves were novices, untested in true combat. Their feeble arrows and magic bolts were blown aside, and one by one they were hurled out of the arena's bounds by sheer force. No fatalities, just swift, humiliating ejections that drew roars and laughter from the growing crowd. Above the field, arcs of magic and sputters of embers drew every eye. Word of the mindless beast's victory over Imamura had already spread like wildfire. People came in droves, eager to see if lightning could strike twice. Some whispered that yesterday's battle had felt more ferocious, more desperate. Today, though, both Ethan's creature and Git's fire dinosaur seemed in no hurry, entertaining, confident, and utterly unchallenged. Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. Let them watch. Let them cheer. As long as his allies proved this formidable, there was no greater advertisement for his growing power. The show had only just begun. Spectators had always praised Ethan's mercy, how he consistently spared those meek, harmless beasts when victory was well within his grasp. Yet now his beloved fire dinosaur towered over a field of fallen elves, its savage swipe having ended the contest in an instant. The contrast was stark. The crowd's anger, which had once been directed at timid creatures for refusing to fight, shifted swiftly onto Ethan himself. Even the very beasts he'd shown kindness to turned away in scorn, goaded by the surviving elves' jeers. Rival trainers fixed Ethan with narrowed, resentful eyes. When the last elf warrior collapsed, the defeated elf trainer, face twisted with fury, staggered across the arena toward him. Without a word, Ethan produced an intermediate energy block and offered it to his fire dinosaur, its scales still smoldering from battle. Only then did he register the hostile stares. Hundreds of faces in the stands were contorted with contempt. Low murmurs of hatred rippled through the crowd. Beside him, the young trainer Git looked up in genuine confusion and whispered, "Ethan, why are they glaring at us like that? I mean, I didn't personally slaughter every one of them." Ethan turned his head away, lips curling in disdain. In his mind he scoffed, "Who made your fire dinosaur so merciless? If bravery doesn't breed hatred, what does?" Each glare felt like a knife's edge. If looks could kill, Ethan would already be bleeding out on the sand. And watching Git tremble beside him, he wouldn't be surprised if his puzzled partner ended up trussed like a pig before the crowd's wrath was spent. It looks like the chapter text itself wasn't included in your message. Please paste the full machine-translated chapter here, and I'll rewrite it into coherent, idiomatic English, renaming Aoki to Ethan and ensuring he's portrayed as male, while preserving all key plot points and details. Chapter 228. Almost there. On Ethan's side, the matches wrapped up first. Having openly displayed his power, none of the other competitors dared to face his fearsome beast without proper support. Jitter was lucky enough to be matched beside him, and the two strongest fighters quietly agreed not to clash, swiftly dispatching only the weaker opponents. With no major skirmishes, their bracket sailed through without drama. Other arenas weren't so fortunate. In one bracket, the two top contenders met in the very first round, and both fell, promptly picked off by opportunistic challengers. Still, it wasn't a catastrophe. Strong fighters who drop into the loser's bracket can claw their way back into the top 16. It just means a longer, tougher path. All told, every battlefield concluded in under 2 hours, and the provisional list of the top 16 was set. Ethan and Jitter then waited more than an hour for the final confirmation. Thanks to ample healers stationed in advance, no elf combatants suffered serious injuries or required extended treatment. And since medical care was free, everyone had thrown themselves into the fights without holding anything back. Various bleeding incidents had become all too common. Several elven trainers sent flying out of the arena by the lumbering beasts counted themselves incredibly fortunate. Their elves had escaped without serious injury, even if the trainers themselves were left shaken. Compared to the wounded still lying in the infirmary, they'd narrowly avoided catastrophe. The 5,000 Alliance coins awarded for surviving the round felt like pure luck. A few even thanked Ethan on the spot, grateful that none of their charges had been gravely harmed. Those who had once viewed Jitter with resentment gradually let go of their hostility. With a capable ally like him watching the sidelines, they were more willing to accept the occasional scratch or bruise. Thanks to the careful, systematic care in the infirmary, the competitors' spirits rebounded surprisingly quickly. At that moment, the referee called everyone's attention and announced the 16 trainers who had qualified for the next stage. Then he reminded them that this afternoon's matches would determine 4 more fighters from the losers' bracket, 4 who would earn the right to challenge those 16. The announcement sent a wave of excitement through those who had been knocked down by stronger opponents. They were eager for a second chance to fight their way back into contention. Everyone who'd slipped into the top 16 by a stroke of luck breathed a silent sigh of relief. Their families understood just how razor-thin the margins had been, and how unlikely any of them were to go much further. At least, even those who fell here would still walk away with 20,000 Union coins, 4 times the consolation awarded to earlier dropouts. When Ethan spotted his name on the scoreboard, he gave a small nod, scooped up his dumb beast, and set off toward the exit. Jitter, who'd been shadowing him all along, tried to keep pace, only to find Ethan's creature stepping directly in his path, hoofs rooted firmly in the dirt. 5 meters away, 4, 3, until, with a grudging snort, Jitter abandoned the chase and watched Ethan's back until he disappeared. Jitter couldn't help grumbling to himself. Ethan didn't understand his own strengths yet, let alone how to wield them with any real gusto. Self-awareness was the hardest lesson of all, and he suspected Ethan would rather avoid it entirely. And maybe that was just how Ethan liked it. Throughout the trials, no one had shown him unkindness. But Ethan had never been the type to strike without provocation. He only defended himself or took action when his interests were directly threatened. Even if it made sense to eliminate someone like Jitter in the arena, he knew well that the fallout, anger, resentment, vendettas, would cost far more than any fleeting advantage. In the end, Ethan was content to walk away, his conscience as clear as the path he strode down. Ethan left the restaurant with a wry smile. Members of the Alliance weren't exactly easy targets, especially not in crowded public spaces, and he'd never actually planned to kill the man who'd been so eager to stop him. Still, the fellow's unshakable enthusiasm grated on Ethan's nerves. At worst, when the trainer came too close, Ethan would quietly summon his clumsy beast to erect an invisible barrier and keep him at bay. On his way back to his cabin, Ethan paused outside the cruise ship's restaurant when a familiar silhouette caught his eye. It was the elderly gentleman who'd tried and failed to persuade Ethan just the day before. Though his efforts hadn't changed Ethan's mind, the sincerity behind them hadn't gone unnoticed. Stepping closer, Ethan saw the old man in the same threadbare coat, a steaming cup of tea in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other, his posture unhurried and utterly at ease. On the SS, Sante Anu, such shabby attire stood out. As diners passed, they sneered. A few even noticed the pokeballs dangling from his belt and couldn't resist casting mocking glances at the underdog trainer. Yet the old man paid them no mind. He continued sipping his tea and scanning the headlines as if the rest of the world simply didn't exist. Ethan slipped up beside the old gentleman, who was engrossed in his newspaper. He set the paper down, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, and waited for the man to look up. "Is that your little brother?" the old man asked, with a surprising twinkle in his eye. "What brings you here?" Since no one else was around to hush him, his voice carried easily. Ethan returned the smile. "I came to thank you for your advice yesterday, sir," he said. The old man waved a dismissive hand. "Ah, don't mention it. I was just worried. When I saw you with such a fine elf, I feared some rival trainer might swoop in and snatch it away. It's a pity. I never expected to find an elf trainer of your caliber around here. You can't afford to be weak in battle." Ethan felt a warm flush at the praise. "Your help yesterday made all the difference. Those other trainers were incredibly strong. Without your guidance, I really would have been stuck. I'm truly grateful." He hesitated for a moment, then added with a shy grin, "By the way, I got my TOEFL scores back yesterday, and I passed." Ethan glanced at his watch. "It's almost noon. Let me treat you to lunch, sir." The old man, who'd been leafing through his newspaper with a cup of tea at his elbow, looked up in surprise. Then his eyes flicked to the bewildered creature by Ethan's side, and he chuckled. Folding the paper with his usual care, he set it aside and raised his teacup in salute. "All right, then. Make it a meal." He caught the waiter's attention. "Bring us the menu, please." When the waiter returned with leather-bound menus, the old man didn't pause to study the list. Instead, he pointed to the priciest item in each section, no appetizers or mid-range choices, until the order sheet was brimming. The waiter's eyes widened as he glanced between the gentleman and Ethan, clearly doubting the table's ability to pay. With a friendly pat on Ethan's shoulder, the old man grinned. "Don't mind me. My young friend here will cover the bill." Ethan met the waiter's uncertain stare, produced his bank card, and handed it over. "We're on a tight schedule. If you could be quick, I'd appreciate it." The waiter bowed and hurried off. Ethan settled back in his chair, forcing a calm smile, but in his head only two words echoed, "Absolute tyrant," because the damage on that extravagant order would come to 30,000 Union coins. Chapter 4. Various Requests and the Elves' Looming Darkness. Ethan poured a bit of water into the old man's cup with a gentle smile, then sat down exactly where he'd been told. The old man watched him for a moment, clearly pleased by his courtesy, and nodded in satisfaction. Folding his hands on the table, he regarded Ethan with a steady gaze and asked, "So what brings you here today?" Chapter 229. Yaoshi. Ethan smiled. You seem able to tell at a glance what level of energy cubes these creatures use, and even their nutritional supplements. I take it you're a scholar who specializes in studying them?" The old man froze. He stared at Ethan's unreadable expression, searching for the slightest flicker of emotion, just as blank as his own mask. At first, he'd been certain the boy had uncovered his true identity and was baiting him into a trap, an all-too-common tactic he'd seen in his line of work. But Ethan's calm words unsettled him. Yes, the kid sensed something was off, yet he was clearly mistaken. Embarrassed, the scholar quickly recovered. After all, here was a young trainer, a mere civilian by all appearances, insisting he join in a lavish meal. How could he refuse such genuine generosity? If Ethan really had a clue about who he was, so be it. Tonight, he would dine heartily. Ethan knew there might be a small payoff in the end. Yet he suspected that the younger folk from last year had the wrong idea about the old man's status. Otherwise, why would someone of his standing spring for such an extravagant meal? Suddenly, the old man's face flushed crimson. Fortunately, age had toughened his skin, hiding any real embarrassment. Ethan watched him closely. He'd already guessed the truth, but chose to stay silent. He wasn't about to blurt it out and risk jeopardizing their fragile rapport. Some things are better left unsaid. "Heh, you're sharp-eyed, young man," the old man said, forcing a laugh as he waved away Ethan's unspoken question. "I admit it. I am indeed a scholar of dumb beasts." With that, he hastily settled the bill, a cool 30,000 renminbi for lunch, which pinched his purse strings more than he liked. As Ethan lowered his gaze, he couldn't help but flash a teasing smile. From the old man's reaction, it was clear he belonged to the Alliance. Having an Alliance scholar indebted to him wasn't a bad outcome. At least he wouldn't have to worry about running afoul of a mercurial temper. Since we're about to discuss a matter concerning a powerful king, even a small misstep could spell disaster. Ethan motioned for the simpleton beast to take the chair beside him, then summoned a massive milk canister and placed it at the creature's side. After all, how else could two people possibly consume a luncheon worth 30,000 union coins? There was no way he could finish it alone. Better to invite the elves over and let them help prevent waste. The moment the giant milk cask appeared, the old man's weary eyes brightened. He turned to the simpleton beast and looked positively amazed. Of course, that creature's nutrition would come straight from the milk cask. A brilliant choice. And by seating the beast at table with its own provisions rather than on the floor, Ethan had shown proper respect. The old man gave an approving nod. Such courtesy toward elves was rare in this era. Ethan cleared his throat, bowing his head in deference. "Sir, if you have a moment, I'd like to ask you a few questions." "By all means," the old man replied, lifting his teacup slowly. His face, gentle once more, settled back into its usual air of wise serenity. Ethan frowned, staring at the flickering flames dancing over the training ground's brazier. "I don't understand," he said. "These so-called dumb beasts are water psychic types by nature. How can they learn fire spells?" The old mage set down his teacup, folded his hands behind his back, and let out a soft hum of amusement. Magic affinities aren't always bound by a creature's elemental origin. Take ghost and psychic types, for instance. Psychics are strong against ghosts, yet ghost-type beings can still learn psychic techniques. Why? Because magical potential has as much to do with the mind as it does with raw elemental alignment. He glanced at Ethan before continuing. Humans, too, can develop psychic abilities. Though you might not see it often, there are individuals with mental fortitude so great they can wield supernatural powers. It all comes down to mental strength, and focused training. The so-called dumb beasts you're studying are water spirits, but their sensitivity to ambient energy actually implies exceptionally strong psychic cores. They may seem sluggish or simple, but beneath that dull exterior lies impressive mental capacity. Give them time and proper guidance, and they can tap into fire magic just as readily as any seasoned sorcerer. Ethan exhaled, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. So it's all about unlocking latent mental strength, not just elemental-type charts. The old mage nodded, a kindly smile creasing his weathered face. Exactly. Never underestimate the power hidden within. Ethan listened intently as the old breeder explained. Their extraordinary mental power gives them far greater control over energy than ordinary elves. That's why even so-called simple beasts can learn fire techniques without difficulty. The old man, renowned throughout the region as both a master breeder and a scholar, went on to enumerate a long list of elemental breath techniques he had cataloged in his research. He'd studied countless elves and crafted specialized high-level energy conduits for them, earning a reputation as a half-scientist, half-wizard. Ethan found himself deep in thought. In truth, he'd never taken the time to unpack all this theory. He simply knew that simple beasts could acquire a few basic fire moves, but beyond that, the reasons had always been unclear, and his handy data chip didn't bother with such details. As long as he could put the techniques to use, he didn't worry over their origins. Now, however, the old man's words stirred his curiosity. So far, simple beasts had only been seen wielding Sunny Day, Jet Flame, and Great Burst fire techniques. Could they master more advanced fire moves if their energy control was refined further? Ethan's pulse quickened. He met the breeder's keen gaze and asked, "What exactly do I need to do to strengthen a simple beast's mental power, and with it, its energy control?" Ethan leaned forward, voice hushed. "Master Windriven, if a brute beast's innate power is almost non-existent, is there any shortcut to boost it quickly?" The old man took a slow sip of his tea before setting the cup down. He regarded Ethan thoughtfully. "You're not asking just about brute beasts, are you? This is a challenge for many of the super elves, and beyond. In truth, you want to know how to ramp up any superpower in record time." Ethan nodded. This was exactly the puzzle that had haunted him since he first encountered those feeble beast specimens. Windriven drummed his cane on the floor. "I've never devoted serious study to speedy power gains, but I've heard a rumor. Some superpowered elves are born with a crystalline formation in their minds. They call it the Yaoshi." "The Yaoshi?" Ethan repeated. "As the legends go, this little gem can condense raw energy, flare, right inside the brain. In rare cases, the flare pulsates within the Yaoshi, granting the elf a sudden surge in power. But, and this is crucial, very few ever develop one, and there's no pattern to it. You might find an apprentice with a Yaoshi and barely any abilities, while a grandmaster's mind remains barren." Ethan's brow furrowed. "So it's completely random?" "Precisely," Windriven said, leaning back. "I've never witnessed it myself. All I know comes from scattered tales passed down in obscure circles. Whether the Yaoshi can be cultivated or even detected remains a mystery." He paused, eyes twinkling. "But if you ever find proof of a living Yaoshi, you'll be holding the key to solving, perhaps revolutionizing, every weakling's power problem." Ethan sat in silence, the old man's words echoing in his mind. The promise of a Yaoshi had lit a new spark of hope, and a fresh path of questions. As the old man spoke, Ethan suddenly recalled something. The analysis chip, programmed to pinpoint the requirements for a rapid surge in superpowers, had flagged an item called Yaoshi. Strangely, the chip offered no explanation of what Yaoshi actually was. Chapter 230, Ogo's Call. Ethan had encountered all manner of superpowers in his travels, yet he'd never heard of anything called a flare. Then again, he'd never pried open anyone's head to look, and unaware such abilities even existed, he'd had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. His implant chip held no record of these flares, so a scan treated it as a perfectly normal component and issued no alerts. Lost in thought, he scarcely noticed the dishes arriving one after another. He resisted the urge to bombard his dining companion with questions, choosing instead to make light conversation. Over the course of the meal, he learned that the man's surname was Liu. His given name, however, remained a mystery. He'd only revealed his family name to put a stop to being called Old Man. Mr. Liu seemed thoroughly pleased. This feast was extravagant after all. Although he had planned to pick up the check, embarrassment struck when the waiter returned Ethan's bank card. It turned out Ethan had settled the bill at the very beginning. Thankfully, no one else noticed. Everyone was far too busy devouring the food, especially Dumb Beast and Big Milk Can, whose prodigious appetites turned the table into a cascade of empty plates and satisfied grunts. Ethan released the beasts simply to avoid wasting the extra feed, and they, true to their nature, even seemed to work harder for it. Elder Liu Sheng, though, was well past his prime and had little appetite. He stood watching the docile creatures slurp from the oversized milk cans, with a faint smile tugging at his lips. When the old man finally finished eating and prepared to leave, he paused in the corridor. Clasping Ethan's shoulder, he said quietly, "Take care of yourself." The warning felt like a small concession. Liu Sheng had been a bit brusque earlier, treating Ethan as nothing more than an elf obsessing over stupid beasts, never guessing the true power behind his calm demeanor. Now, perhaps out of embarrassment for having extorted him, he offered the parting admonition. But what danger lay ahead? Before Ethan could ask, Liu Sheng merely waved, then melted into the shadows at the end of the passageway. "Take care of myself," Ethan mused, watching the old man's silhouette vanish. He returned to his cabin and sank onto the sofa, mind racing. He'd sensed something odd aboard this ship, an unease he couldn't pin down. Liu Sheng's cryptic warning only confirmed it. Whatever lay before him on this voyage, it wasn't going to be easy. Ethan sat up abruptly on the sofa, a sudden thought striking him. Since he'd boarded the Santa Anu, he hadn't once caught sight of a sailor. He knew crew members rarely loitered in the cabins, most stayed at their stations or in the cockpit, but they still drifted through the corridors every now and then. Yet he'd seen none. Then again, Ethan admitted, he'd scarcely left his cabin. Still, the voyage itself felt increasingly bizarre. Even First Mate Yamamoto was behaving oddly. There was little Ethan could do about it now, though. If things really went awry, he had two options: slip away on his own, or appeal to Captain Liu Sheng. With the captain's reputation as a heavenly king, no one in the Alliance dared refuse his will. Ethan had already knocked on that door more than once, begging for safe passage, and each time Liu Sheng had answered without hesitation. As for the Alliance officers, they were indecisive but well-intentioned, and the afternoon battle time reserved for the losers? That was their affair, not his. Ethan leaned back again, determined to keep his wits about him until he either uncovered the ship's secrets or secured his escape. I led the elves indoors for their training and settled myself on a cushion to meditate. My heart, however, wasn't in it. Worry nagged at me, and the minutes dragged on. Halfway through, my comm unit buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, a message from Ogo asking if I had a moment for a video call. Fortunately, the Santa Anu's luxury suite is equipped with a HoloLink capable of instantaneous long-range transmission. I told the elves to continue on their own, walked over to the display console, and tapped Ogo's contact. In an instant, his face appeared on the screen. "Ethan!" Ogo greeted me with a broad grin. Behind him was the familiar warmth of his study, shelves of data crystals, and a soft lamplight. "Barely a few days," I replied, returning the smile. "How have you been?" Ogo chuckled, running a hand through his unruly hair. "Great news. The buyers are interested in your ability block formula." I explained its effects in detail, but since you never spelled out your terms, I held off on naming a price or delivery schedule. I nodded. That was exactly why I'd called him in the first place. Ogo's negotiation skills were nearly as sharp as his sense of timing. Now I just needed to decide how much I was willing to charge for my breakthrough. Silence stretched as I gathered my thoughts, the elves' distant exercises echoing through the suite. Finally, I met Ogo's expectant gaze. "All right," I said, "let's talk numbers." Ethan slapped his forehead as he remembered something he'd meant to do earlier. He'd planned to text Dawu and negotiate some terms, but he'd completely forgotten. Standing in the workshop, he took out his communicator and dialed. When Dawu answered, Ethan dove right in. "Listen, I want to trade this recipe for a reliable way to raise a Grand Milk Tank Elf's aptitude. You know I've got one, but when I took him in, his initial stats were only average. I'd like to improve both his qualifications and his potential. Grand Milk Tanks don't come up for trade often. There's almost no circulation, so trading seems like my only option." Dawu's brow furrowed. "That's going to be tough. You know the secret to improving elf aptitudes is fiercely guarded. I doubt your energy cube formula has reached the level required to crack it." "There are actually dozens of rumored methods," Dawu continued, "but almost every discovery has been an accident. No fixed procedure or item works reliably, at least not without hundreds of thousands of trials. It's practically impossible to pin down." Ethan nodded, undeterred. "I understand the difficulty. All I'm asking is to swap my Grand Milk Tank Elf for whatever proven method exists to boost its aptitude. There simply aren't many of them available right now." Dawu sighed heavily. Very well, I'll see what I can find, but don't get your hopes up. Ethan rubbed his temples. Even if they agreed to teach me, it wouldn't mean much. I can sign a non-disclosure agreement without revealing any trade secrets, and if that's not enough, I'd be willing to invest whatever's needed to protect the methods. He glanced at Ogo. Xiaoqian's family already holds a near monopoly on the large milk tanks. Leaking a quality improvement technique wouldn't hurt them. They'd just absorb any minor setbacks. Frankly, I might as well be giving them my formula for free. Ogo massaged the bridge of his nose, clearly torn. Ethan, I know you're reasonable, but these are my family's secrets we're talking about. It's not something you can measure in dollars and cents. I'll help you make the request, but I can't guarantee they'll agree. This involves a lot of people, powerful people. He sighed. Ogo's clan was wealthier than the milk tank operation, but right now they couldn't risk a frontal challenge. If word got out, or if someone in the Fengyuan aristocracy caught wind of our plans, the backlash against the more modest Chengdu families could be devastating. Ethan studied him, expression calm but insistent. Just ask. Whatever happens, I'll handle it. Ogo hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, but I don't know if I should have promised you in the first place. It looks like the actual chapter text didn't come through. What you've posted appears to be a request for tickets and subscriptions rather than the story itself. Could you please paste the full machine-translated chapter you'd like rewritten? Once I have the text, I'll be happy to transform it into a smooth, idiomatic English version with Ethan as our male protagonist. Chapter 231, Hidden Danger. Ethan and Ogo spent the next hour trading insights, most of them about the elves. Physically, Ogo was the stronger of the two, but when it came to elven lore and arcane knowledge, Ethan held the clear advantage. As they talked, Ethan took on the role of teacher, explaining complex histories and mystical theories, while Ogo listened attentively, occasionally pausing to jot down notes. An outsider who walked in at that moment would have done a double take. Here sat the heir apparent of the mighty German corporation, long famed for its vast repositories of occult research, learning from a young earthborn named Ethan. In truth, even among the corporation's senior scholars, fewer than a dozen people could match Ethan's mastery of its archives. He owed much of that ability to the neural data chip implanted in his brain, which let him access the company's database instantaneously. To someone who didn't know the truth, it was as if he possessed supernatural recall. And yet, Ogo was no mere novice. As the future head of the German corporation, he brought his own hard-won insights to the table, perspectives that surprised Ethan more than once. Every time Ogo uncovered a fresh interpretation of an old elven rune or proposed a novel theory on their magic, Ethan found himself nodding in genuine admiration. It was a reminder that strength and knowledge were only part of the equation. Sometimes, seeing the world through another person's eyes revealed hidden truths. By the time their discussion wound down, both young men were buzzing with new ideas, and neither was quite the same as when they'd begun. The elves remained an enduring mystery, but together, Ethan and Ogo felt closer than ever to unraveling their secrets. Despite having spent 2 generations in the elven realm, Ethan still carries many of his old earthborn habits and ideas. Ogo, on the other hand, is a true native, so wholly elven in his outlook that his every turn of phrase sounds exotic to Ethan's ears. Their worlds collide most vividly whenever the topic turns to stones. Ogo's enthusiasm is contagious. The moment he realizes that Ethan not only recognizes but can name every sort of gem and mineral he mentions, his eyes light up and he nearly drags Ethan off for a proper conversation. Were it not for an urgent phone call interrupting them, Ogo insists he would have bought Ethan a cup of coffee and talked stones from dusk until dawn. Ethan, for his part, matches Ogo's excitement. As a trainer and current league champion, he's surprising even the elves with his knowledge of rare crystals and fragments, knowledge that, ironically, surpasses many of the elves' own. Mid-discussion, Ethan gently asks whether Ogo has ever come across any high-grade dark stones. Ogo shakes his head with regret. His true passion lies in cataloging obscure, unnamed specimens. He's never made a point of collecting evolutionary stones or other well-known treasures. I'll keep my eyes open, Ogo promises. The moment I find something, you'll be the first to know. Ethan shook his head. Honestly, we don't need top-grade darkstones. Any of them will do. There's hardly a noticeable difference. Dawu nodded in agreement. All stones are stones. Worrying over grades won't get us anywhere. As they chatted, Ethan glanced at his screen and asked casually, "By the way, Ogo, have you ever heard of a super evolution stone?" Ogo paused. Super evolution stone? I don't recall anything by that name. Ethan described what little he knew, and to his surprise, Ogo's eyes lit up. Where did you see one of those? How rare is it? Tell me everything. Ethan hesitated, momentarily flustered. He'd intended to keep the stone's existence a secret, but Ogo was so curious and clearly eager to track one down that Ethan decided to come clean. If Ogo couldn't find a genuine super evolution stone on his own, Ethan could trade one of his for something valuable in return. He could even loop Dawu in and tap into Devon's vast resources to aid in the search. Still, although Ethan possessed Dia's super evolution stone, he wasn't ready to use it. He'd heard rumors about the stone's power. Once activated, it could trigger catastrophic side effects. Better to hold off until he fully understood what he was dealing with. Before they knew it, 2 hours had slipped by in a single video call. They'd brainstormed every lead they could think of, but Ogo remained no closer to finding the artifact. Ethan finally cleared his throat. Let's wrap this up for now. We'll pick it back up tomorrow. No point wasting the whole afternoon. He ended the call with a laugh. Who'd have thought chasing down a legendary stone would feel so much like catching up with an old friend? Ethan leaned back and exchanged notes with Ogo about elven lore. At one point, Ogo asked him about the custom energy module they'd salvaged from the Iron Golem. Its mysterious chip still hadn't been fully analyzed. Ethan suspected that the lab experiment was nowhere near completion. He let out a long breath and wiped the sweat from his brow. Though the conversation with Ogo was friendly, Ethan had bent over backward to keep up with every tangent. Fortunately, after a calming chat with Dawu, his nerves finally settled. Whatever lay ahead on the Santeanu, he told himself, he could handle it. As long as he stayed cool-headed, he'd manage to save his own life. Still, prudence demanded a solid plan, and he resolved to prepare accordingly. The afternoon slipped away as the elves immersed themselves in training. Ghoststone showed the most striking progress. His innate poisonous affinity had been honed, and he'd unlocked a rare venom technique that let him wield his toxic energy with precision. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to draw small amounts of poison gas from the container he'd sealed earlier. About 20% of the gas remained, a vast reservoir of power. Ethan watched the ghost stone's pale glow deepen to a soft, ethereal blue. Once fully absorbed, its hidden energy would elevate his beast companion by an entire rank. It wouldn't match the instantaneous power of true spirit energy, but it was more than enough to make a difference. After dinner, Ethan slipped quietly from his quarters. He paused in the washroom, his beast crouched at his side, mapping the precise spatial coordinates for their next jump. Back in his room, Ethan changed into fresh clothes and carefully refitted the human skin mask that hid his features. With a tremor of power, the beast activated its teleportation ability, and in an instant, they were hurled backward through time to their target moment. Ethan slid open the high window of the latrine, eased himself onto the sill, and dropped lightly to the ground below. The beast materialized beside him, its powerful shoulders rippling beneath its fur. High atop Santa Ana Keep, Lord Yamamoto and Commander Koguchi reclined before a darkened vid screen. Each held a goblet of deep crimson wine, the only light in the room flickering from a small lamp over the call terminal. "It's proceeding exactly as we planned," Yamamoto murmured, swirling the liquid in his glass. "When will he arrive?" Koguchi set his goblet on a carved oak table, his expression unreadable. The vid screen remained blank. Without that faint red glow, any observer would assume the line was dead. Yet the little call indicator lamp blinked steadily, belying the silence. After a moment, the speaker crackled. A rough, hoarse voice broke the quiet. "I'm in position." Ethan pressed a finger against his earpiece. "Hold on, I've got a hunch some League agents have slipped in. Stay sharp." He set the phone down, let his hand cradle the stem of his wine glass, then, rather than a dainty sip, tilted it back and drained every drop. "The League, huh? You're a real pain in the neck," he muttered, wiping his mouth. Maybe you should clear out your own internal bugs before poking around our business. We're getting tipped off every time you make a move." Silence crackled on the line. Finally, the caller's gravelly voice resurfaced, not answering Ethan's jab, but pivoting. "So how's that, new batch performing?" Ethan allowed himself a slow smile. "Not bad. A few of them have gotten sharper. And speaking of sharp," he tapped his glass against the table, "you might want to up your game too. Don't force me to wipe the floor with your guys every time. Keep this up, and we won't need your help at all." His eyes darkened. "Don't push us past our limit. Once this operation wraps, we're laying low. Just do me a favor and keep improving." The caller snapped on the word improving with audible emphasis. "Ha! My concern isn't you. It's your boss. Why is he never the one calling? You just keep sending lackeys." Ethan's grin widened. "All right then, let's get ready for round 2. I'm not sure I follow. Could you clarify what you mean by monthly and recommendation tickets? Are you referring to a specific website or service? Let me know the details, and I'll do my best to help." Chapter 232, Locate the Island. Ethan plunged through the shattered window, hurtling toward the open sea. Just as he and the dim beast were about to crash into the water, the creature's latent levitation power flared to life, cushioning their descent and setting them gently on the ocean's surface. Ethan didn't hesitate. He drew an unassuming elf ball from his belt and flung it into the swell. Almost immediately, the sea boiled beneath a towering surge of water as a colossal Tyrannosaurus broke free from the orb's shimmering seal. The massive predator, long confined, pampered, and overfed inside that tiny sphere, shook off its confinement, its enormous tail lashing the waves as it lumbered free. For a moment, the Tyrannosaurus seemed poised to unleash a deafening roar, venting months of pent-up frustration. After all, being treated like a gluttonous pet had fattened him beyond his prideful status as the ocean's true overlord. But before a single bellow escaped, a single icy command cut through the roar. "Silence!" The Tyrannosaur's jaw snapped shut. A frigid shiver raced through its massive haunches, and its roar died on the wind. It stared at Ethan, this small human wielding astonishing power, with glowing, wary eyes. In its gaze, Ethan was no mere boy. He was something far more fearsome, a devil in disguise, whose voice carried absolute authority. Ethan mounted the dim beast's broad back. The creature unfurled leathery wings and rose into the sky, lifting both master and companion high above the subdued dinosaur. From that vantage, the endless blue stretched in every direction, but somewhere out there lay the island Ethan sought. Side by side atop the dim beast's wings, Ethan scanned the horizon. The ocean was vast, but he trusted his instincts. Soaring over the mighty Tyrannosaurus below, he set his sights on the distant cloud line and the secrets awaiting him on the hidden island. Ethan planted his feet firmly on the deck and spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Quiet now. Slip off the cruise ship before anyone notices." He stamped once on the planks, then gestured sharply. Obeying his command, the Tyrannosaurus lowered itself into the water and began to swim away. It moved deliberately, almost silently, careful not to stir up a splash. Against the ship's forward momentum, the creature carried Ethan swiftly into the open sea. Unbeknownst to Ethan, an old man stood on the top deck, watching his every move. This was Liu Sheng, the same man Ethan had glimpsed at lunch, who now stood cloaked in shadow above the roaring conversation in Yamamoto's cabin below. When Liu Sheng's gaze drifted toward Ethan's retreating figure, a faint, knowing smile curved his lips. His mouth didn't part to speak, but the shape it formed clearly read, "Interesting little fellow." Fortunately for Ethan, he had been cautious. He had summoned only a handful of elves, and he still wore his dark mask. Had he revealed more of his power, or his face, Liu Sheng might have judged him far more harshly. As it was, the old man could identify Ethan only by his height under the black robe and the massive beast at his side. Silently, Ethan and his dinosaur vanished beyond the cruise ship's wake, unaware that their departure had already piqued the curiosity of one of the ship's most formidable passengers. Ethan pressed his lips together as he whispered to the scout at his side, "Did you notice anything strange today?" "Nothing obvious," the scout replied, "but it's best if we leave right now. Where are we headed?" Old Man Yagori barely registered their hushed exchange. His eyes were locked on the darkened corridor below, where Yamamoto was meeting a shadowy figure. Ethan caught snippets of the conversation traveling up the stone stairs. The stranger's cold voice carried clear as ice. "I lack the funds for proper research, but I can reward you well if you hand him over." A glint of steel appeared in Yamamoto's eyes. After months of hiding, this was the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. Ethan and his scout slipped away under cover of darkness, putting as much distance between themselves and the chamber as possible. No sooner had they reached the shore than the massive shape of the dinosaur they'd rescued emerged from the surf. The great Tyrannosaurus Rex, whose loyalty to Ethan was absolute, surged forward. Powerful strokes of its paddle-like tail sent them skimming across the water's surface at astonishing speed, an instinctive, long-forgotten dance with the sea. Ripples from their passage caught the attention of a band of wild elves drifting nearby on makeshift rafts. Curious, they steered closer, to within bowshot of the T-Rex. In an instant, the dinosaur reared up, unleashing a thunderous roar that rattled every bone in their bodies. The elves froze, awe and terror wrestling in their faces. Then, as one, they scattered, no skill or magic strong enough to stand against the sight of that primeval power. Ethan watched them flee, heart-pounding. With the coast clear, he clapped a hand on the dinosaur's scaly flank. "Thank you, old friend," he murmured. Ahead lay uncertainty, and enemies who would pay any price to find him. But for now, he had bought himself time. And that was everything. Although several elves here outclassed him, none dared to confront the Tyrannosaurus Rex. They paused at the forest's edge, exchanged uneasy glances, then slipped back into their territory. After all, everyone knew a T-Rex never traveled alone. If its pack appeared, even the strongest elves would be overwhelmed. One beast was terrifying enough, but a horde would be a nightmare. He felt their fear like a weight in his chest, sapping both his strength and his spirit. In this elven glade, he felt almost humiliated. He was far more at ease in the sea, where he ruled unchallenged as the overlord of the waves. But here, surrounded by pennants and archers, he seemed small. He cast a sidelong look at Ethan and the dull-witted creatures perched overhead. Neither man nor monster paid him any heed. A fierce urge flared within his throat. With no warning, he threw back his head and unleashed a planet-shaking roar. For a full minute, his voice thundered through the trees, rattling branches and echoing off distant hills. When the last echo faded, he stood motionless, chest heaving. An exhilarating rush of relief flooded him. It had been far too long since he'd let out a true roar. In that moment, he felt alive again. Ethan's body froze the instant something massive drifted overhead, blotting out the pale sunlight. A devil ray, its broad wings undulating silently, hovered above him, eyeing him with inscrutable intent. Every nerve in his body coiled with tension, and for a heartbeat he simply couldn't move. The creature finally glided away, and relief washed over him. He exhaled, refocused, and kicked fiercely to catch up to the Tyrannosaurus gliding through the waves ahead. But he wasn't ready to let the dinosaur carry him all the way to Deadleaf City. The Santa Anu had already been sailing for a full day, and though the ship was no slouch, trying to swim back once they'd passed would cost him far too much time. Then Ethan spotted land, a small island emerging on the horizon like a green beacon. An idea sparked in his mind. He'd plant a superhuman coordinate marker there, a teleportation waypoint. If anything went disastrously wrong aboard the Santa Anu, he could instantly summon his dumb beasts back to this safe point, rather than drift helplessly at sea with no sense of direction. His decision made, he summoned his dark carp, vaulted onto its sleek back, and readied himself for the short dash to shore. As the fish's fins churned the water into froth, Ethan steeled himself to secure the island waypoint and ensure his escape route remained open. Ethan stared at the little island growing on the horizon and thought through his options. Ideally, he'd have the beast surface and drop a coordinate marker every time they passed a waypoint, so if disaster struck, he wouldn't end up drifting helplessly at sea. When the danger first became apparent, he'd even considered disembarking right away and catching the next cruise back to Deadleaf City. But that would squander too much time, and right now, time was his most precious commodity. More than anything, Ethan was desperate to unlock the first 3 skills. Once he'd mastered them, the beast's attack range would expand by another 30%. He murmured under his breath, "Please let nothing go wrong. Just get me to the prosperity zone. Deep down, however, he knew his hopes were overly optimistic. Moments ago, a powerful Alliance king had boarded the ship and warned everyone to stay on high alert. He was 90% certain this voyage would end in chaos. The island looked almost within reach, but even at full speed, the Tyrannosaurus took a solid 20 minutes before its massive feet finally thudded onto the beach. With its massive tail churning through the water, the Tyrannosaurus Rex panted heavily. Swimming at full tilt had clearly exhausted its stamina. Ethan dashed to the shoreline, rifled through his pack, and tossed several mid-grade energy cubes toward the great beast. The moment they struck its flank, the dinosaur roared as its strength surged back, then shuddered and collapsed into the elven orb. 3 down. Chapter 233, Preparing in Advance. Ethan hovered above the tiny island, its barren rock jutting from the azure sea like a forgotten sentinel. Even up close, the place was lifeless, just a few scraggly trees clinging to the stone. It was exactly the remote spot he needed. He and the beast touched down only long enough for Ethan to anchor one of his superpower coordinates into the island's center. "Ready, boy?" he asked. The massive, slow-witted creature let out a low grunt and nodded. Its simple way of saying it was prepared. Ethan laid a hand on the beast's flank and wove one of his rare abilities into the creature's own power network. By sharing this link, he would supply just enough energy to ease the beast's effort when they teleported, preventing it from burning out. A soft blue glow crept up the beast's hide, wrapping them both in a shimmering aura. Within seconds, the light flashed brilliant white, and they vanished. When the world snapped back into focus, they were standing in Ethan's private cabin aboard the cruise ship. No one on the corridor outside would suspect their sudden arrival. The beast panted heavily, visibly drained by the instant jump. Ethan set down a glass of milk he'd prepared earlier. The creature drank it in one long gulp, then curled into a meditative pose to recover its strength. Ethan turned away, peeling off his travel-worn clothes and stowing them neatly. He crossed to the containment ward and released his elves with a wave of his hand. This afternoon, they would train together, sparring, exchanging techniques, and sharpening each other's skills. With his team assembled and the groundwork laid, Ethan felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Ethan surveyed the assembled elves, tall, lithe figures still humming with the energy of today's drills. Certain skills, like the art of provocation, simply couldn't be performed by a lone practitioner. Their progress had been excellent. Tonight, instead of a soothing massage or another round of training, he instructed them to form a protective circle. Beside him, the once-wounded beast, now fully healed, crouched obediently. Ethan ruffled its coarse mane. "Raise your aura barrier and envelop us all." At his command, the beast's energy flared. Within moments, a translucent dome of power sprang up around Ethan and every elf in the ring. Ethan reached into his ring and drew out a small glass vial, uncorking it with care. Inside was the ground milk he'd collected on the trial island, a rare, milky elixir. He'd already sold half the vial, exactly 200 drops, to cover their expenses. Though the sale had earned him a tidy sum, he'd held back the remaining 200 drops as a last resort. Now, as he lifted the vial to inspect its contents, a fresh, sweet fragrance drifted upward, lingering safely within the protective barrier. All the elves inhaled deeply as the sweet, earthy aroma filled the air, and the wariness of the day seemed to melt away. At once, every pair of eyes turned to the small vial in Ethan's hand. The dark ravens and the lizard folk recognized it at a glance, but the rest watched in curious silence. "This is Earth Core milk," Ethan explained, holding the vial up to catch the torchlight. "You won't experience its full power yet, but it's still effective against hidden or lingering injuries the scanners can't detect. Even if you show no outward sign of the dark disease, small wounds and internal damage can fester and sometimes go unnoticed until they become serious." He paused to let the meaning sink in. "Especially those of you who fought alone for years, old wounds can flare up without warning." Ethan carefully measured out 2 drops for each elf, applying the pale fluid beneath their tongues. Once they'd taken it, he nodded and sent them back to their quarters. The Earth Core milk would seep into their systems gradually, healing what could not be seen and fortifying them against the darkness within. That night, Even Ghoststone could consume the Earth Core milk. After all, it was little more than a concentrated energy source. So, except for Ghoststone standing his silent vigil, the rest of the elves slept soundly, allowing their bodies to metabolize the milk naturally. Dawn came with Ethan's mischievous grin. As he stretched, the elves filed past him in single file, bleary-eyed and half asleep, on their way to the latrines. Their haggard expressions prompted a teasing chuckle from Teo Ao. "Enjoying the main event jitters?" Teo Ao called out good-naturedly. "Very funny." Ethan shot back, with a playful roll of his eyes. Today marked the start of the main event. But before the original 16 competitors could face one another, each had to be challenged and defeated by one of 4 warriors who'd advanced from the loser's bracket. In the rush to get started, however, the arena doors had opened the moment any challenger and defender stood before the referee. Since nobody stepped up to challenge Ethan, no one waited for him. By the time Ethan and the rest of the original 16 arrived, the 4 preliminary matches were already over. A hush fell across the crowd, disappointment mixed with awe, when they learned that 3 of the 4 losers had triumphed against veterans of the main bracket. The main event was off to a shockingly bold start. In this tournament, even a strong team knocked out in the preliminaries can still fight its way back through the losers' bracket so long as they can win their challenge matches. It didn't take long for the day's contests to begin. Because only a handful of teams had registered, all the games were held in the same hall, which was booked for the entire day. Fortunately for Ethan, his draw wasn't until the afternoon, so he had no matches to play in the morning. He drifted into the spectator area and scanned the crowd. That's when he saw him, the one teammate he'd grown to dislike, Jitter. The moment Jitter spotted Ethan, he broke free from his group and charged over, a grin plastered across his face. But before he could reach Ethan, Li Qingmu, the team's hulking, soft-spoken enforcer, stepped in, planting himself squarely between them and keeping Jitter at least half a meter away. Jitter, who had played a morning round but wasn't up in the first bracket match, must have been looking for Ethan to commiserate or congratulate him. Ethan couldn't tell which. He spread his arms as if for a big, friendly hug, only to be rebuffed by Li Qingmu's immovable stance. Stifling a scowl, Jitter shot Ethan a resentful look, but Ethan simply turned his attention back to the court, as if he hadn't noticed. Defeated, Jitter huffed and took a seat beside Ethan. Within moments, he was completely absorbed in the ongoing match, proof, if any were needed, that his true passion was the game itself, not the company. Ethan let him watch in peace and settled in for an afternoon of competition. Ethan felt a thrill of excitement as he watched the match. Down on the field, 2 10-year-old boys barked orders at their elves, commanding them with such intensity that it was hard to look away. Yet Ethan's attention was elsewhere. He slipped quietly to the referee's stand. To keep everyone's spirits high, Director Yamamoto had his secretary place the top 3 prizes directly on the referee's chair. Unlike manager Imamura, who handed out union coins only after a defeat, Yamamoto had already prepared and released all 4 skill CDs in advance. Third place earned 300,000 union coins, paid out in cash there and then. Next to the skill CDs, a small stack of colorful booster pyramids drew even more stares. In today's tournaments, most competitors spent their winnings on new cards, and 300,000 union coins was more money than most players saw in a month. Ethan and his little pet arrived at the podium. The creature, Ethan's ever-loyal companion, quietly placed a superpower coordinate token on the table. Ethan offered a brief nod and then slipped back to Jite's side. Jite didn't even glance at him, eyes glued to the battlefield as the action unfolded. Ethan shifted his weight, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. Finishing in 4th place stung more than he'd expected. Chapter 234, The Blue Turban. The arena's 2 remaining trainers were locked in a fierce duel, each with only a single elf left to fight. Blow after blow was traded until, at last, one of them eked out a narrow victory. As the match ended, Git strode back toward the sideline, grinning from ear to ear. "Ethan," he called, flashing both rows of teeth, "just wait, next round I'm sweeping it 3-0. Ethan didn't even bother to reply. The very next match was Git's, and he had no interest in watching another foregone conclusion. He lingered at the edge of the arena until the bell rang. Then, the moment he caught sight of Git's opponent, an underpowered trainer only marginally stronger than Takashi Imamura, he shook his head and walked away. It would be too one-sided. Git would win in straight sets and might only send out a second elf as a formality. Besides, this whole format felt off to Ethan. Here they were, two trainers each armed with a gun, yet choosing to club each other's elves into submission. Knock your opponent's creature to the ground, and you win. Why bother with all that firepower? He turned his attention to the locker cabin and froze. Old man Yanagyu, who had been here just yesterday, was gone without a trace. Ethan had planned to strike up a conversation, but when he found no one to talk to, he went straight back to his cabin. He barely stopped to unpack. By his estimate, the afternoon game wouldn't start for hours, and he'd be waiting in line long before it was his turn. Inside the room, he changed into his uniform, carefully stowed away the hulking dull beast, and slipped back out. Its unwieldy form would invite unwanted attention if he carried it openly. He hugged the shadows, dodging the ship's service staff as he made his way to the lower deck promenade beneath the cabins. Since they'd set sail, he hadn't seen a single sailor in the passenger quarters. Maybe that was simply protocol. Crew members weren't supposed to mingle with guests. Still, Ethan didn't believe any rule was airtight. No matter how disciplined the sailors, sooner or later one would wander into the residential decks, if only for a moment. It was that crack in the system that made everything feel intriguing. Ethan moved slowly down the dimly lit corridor, the elven beast orb clutched in his hand. He had learned that at the first sign of trouble, he could summon the dumb beast, trapped within the orb, and he wasn't about to risk returning to his cabin tonight. This was his first real chance to slip away unnoticed, and so far, no one had crossed his path. When he reached the first sailor's quarters, Ethan pressed his eye to the small window. A lone sailor hunched over a crate, loading supplies with methodical care. Nothing about the man's movements flagged danger. Ethan's brow furrowed, but after a moment's careful study, he saw no reason to hesitate. He eased himself along the corridor's shadowed edge and continued onward. A few minutes later, he arrived at the sailor's cloakroom. Leaning against the wall, he peered both ways to make sure the hallway was empty before slipping inside. The room was exactly what he expected: rows of hooks, lockers half filled with oilskins, and the mingled stench of sweat and salt spray hanging heavy in the air. Ethan scanned every shelf and locker, but there was nothing out of the ordinary here either. He took a slow, steady breath, willing his heart to settle. Then, just as he was about to move on, a calm voice drifted in from outside the door. "Is everything all right in there?" Ethan crouched behind the locker, heart hammering against his ribs. From the narrow crack in the door, he could just make out two sailors in hushed but urgent tones. "Relax," said the first. "The engines are running perfectly, and all external readings are within parameters." "Shut up," the second hissed. "There are some things you just don't talk about. You think adults don't notice?" He paused, then added more quietly, "And next time I snag a snack from the galley, you'd better keep your mouth shut, got it?" "Got it, crystal clear," the first voice muttered, and footsteps receded down the corridor. When the silence finally settled, Ethan waited a few seconds, then slipped out from his hiding place. The stifling odor of unwashed uniforms and stale sea air made him wrinkle his nose, but he forced himself to move methodically, door by door. He laid his fingers on the worn brass handles of each seaman's locker and tapped, listened, searched for clues. By the time he reached the last locker, frustration was beginning to edge out his caution. He threw the door open and poked through a jumble of sweat-stained shirts and trousers. At the very bottom, like a buried treasure, lay a neatly folded blue turban. He lifted it, brushing away lint, and froze. An embroidered symbol peeked from the hem, a mark he recognized from whispered rumors and half-forgotten warnings. Blood pounded in his ears as his hand trembled. The moment stretched taut, and in the dim light below decks, Ethan's pupils contracted to pinpoints. Whatever secret this turban held, it was bigger than he'd ever imagined. Ethan stared at the turban in the cabinet, his heart pounding. He forced himself to double-check the emblem embroidered in crisp white on the blue fabric, then snapped the drawer shut and locked it. Without a word of explanation, he summoned his beast companion, who padded in behind him, eyes wide with confusion. Ethan said nothing as he led the creature back into the room. Once inside, he sank onto the sofa and stared at the floor for several long moments. What he'd just discovered was terrifying, enough to make a lesser man cry out in shock. A heavy weight settled in Ethan's chest. To most people, that white symbol on the turban would look like a simple logo, but Ethan knew better. That mark belonged to a power that, in this timeline, should still be buried deep in its incubation stage. Yet here it was, plain as day. If the organization truly had this artifact in its hands, then Shante Anu had grown far more dangerous than anyone had realized. A chill ran down Ethan's spine as a new thought struck him. Could Yamamoto and Yamato really be working together? He whispered, voice tight. The very idea made his blood run cold. Ethan listened, brow furrowed. So the man's true name was Yamato Yamamoto, yet everyone who saw him that day simply called him Yamato. In hindsight, Imara Takuya's terrified expression suddenly made sense. It had been genuine. Ethan pressed his lips together as he thought of the Alliance King's crown-class contender, Liu Sheng. Why would someone of Liu Sheng's stature board the ship wearing such a sour, almost resentful look? Something about the whole affair felt off. He reminded himself to stay on guard, particularly around that mysterious organization, and, above all, Yamato Yamamoto. At first glance, Yamato's eyes had locked onto Ethan's with a flicker of recognition, but he'd said nothing. Then there were the 3 skill discs awarded to the tournament champion, usable only by beast-type players. Why that restriction? Why the lightning-fast match schedule? And why such extravagant prizes? Prizes so generous they bordered on reckless spending. It was as if the organizers had orchestrated every detail in advance, driving the competition forward at a relentless pace. There was barely time to catch one's breath between stops, and even if someone lost, the preliminary round would finish by that afternoon. Ethan stared at the fading daylight outside his window, weighed down by the choices before him. In just one day, this competition would be over, and all things considered, slipping away unnoticed wouldn't be difficult. He'd thought it through from every angle and boiled his options down to 2. He could walk away from Santeanu now, cut his losses, and let someone else take the risks. Or he could stay, fight his way to first place and claim the prize, but that path was fraught with danger and uncertainty. He didn't even know if he'd survive to the end of the contest. He sank onto the couch, his expression dark. His debts kept mounting, but at least his obligation to the alliance leader was almost cleared. With 2 helmsmen, a chaplain, and a captain still under his command, he'd managed to shoulder every burden they'd thrown at him. But tomorrow, even that would be behind him. Free of debts and subordinates alike, he could finally vanish, if he dared. Chapter 2 and 35, Tears of Resolve. That afternoon, once the announcement crackled over the loudspeakers, Ethan made his way back to the arena. He paused at the edge of the elevated judges' stand, where 3 gleaming prizes hovered under spotlights, each one more dazzling than the last. Any ordinary spectator, he thought, would be tempted to enter the contest just for a chance at them. And if they had no appetite for danger, they'd be wise to leave now, before the real threats revealed themselves. But Ethan didn't go. He'd spent the morning mulling things over in the sailors' quarters, weighing his options. Yes, the prizes were irresistible. Yamamoto's presentation was nothing short of masterful, but that alone wouldn't have convinced him to stay. What mattered more was old man Yagyu, the crusty veteran with whom he'd broken bread. As long as Yagyu remained at his side, Ethan knew he wouldn't be forced into a fight he couldn't win or trapped by foes he couldn't outwit. Besides, he refused to believe the Alliance would dispatch nothing but a king-level powerhouse for this skirmish. Of course, what Ethan didn't yet realize was that Liu Sheng's involvement had been entirely spontaneous, and soon enough they would all discover just how unpredictable this contest and its true stakes could become. Ethan wasn't really an envoy sent by the fighters aboard the ship. Most of those envoys were ordinary Alliance trainers, hardly the elite warriors they claimed to be. He'd long since realized that the League often won by sheer numbers, a fact that now played tricks on his mind. Every time he counted heads in the stadium, he half expected more contenders to pour in, tipping the scales in the League's favor. Then there was the matter of the blue-turbaned operative he'd spotted earlier. Ethan recognized that organization as powerful in its own right, but still no match for Team Rocket. What puzzled him was their timing. Why make an appearance so early in the tournament? If a full-scale conflict were imminent, the League's usual tactic was to hold back and observe before unleashing its true strength. For Ethan's plan to work, their leader would need the sense to stay under the Alliance's radar and not draw any needless attention. Otherwise, this competition could spiral into something far more dangerous. That left one thing for Ethan to worry about: the ever-present, perpetually smiling Yamato Yamayama. He squared his shoulders on the battlefield, knowing that even a hint of hesitation might be all it took to give Yamayama the opening he craved. By the time Ethan reached his mark, the crowd had already settled into an expectant hush, and his opponent was clearly ready. A few moments' delay, and he'd be disqualified. Opposite him stood a young woman, barely 20, her dark hair pulled back into a severe ponytail. Her features were calm, almost impassive, but her eyes shone with concentrated focus. Ethan took a steadying breath. This match wouldn't just test his skills, it would reveal whether he could keep his head when everything around him threatened to fall apart. And win or lose, he knew the real battle was only just beginning. Ethan drew a blank when the referee announced his opponent. Only as the whistle blew did he register her name, Xiangzi. Without another word, the battle began. Ethan recalled his sign elf, Dumbbeast, into the arena. Across from him, Xiangzi released her first Pokémon Mouthflower. The slender, grass and poison type gleamed a rich gold under the stadium lights, its fair-eyed stare cool and confident. Ethan's battle chip instantly scanned its stats, a high-class grass elf with potent poison attributes. He remembered his last duel against Takashi Imamura, where he'd relied on a fierce fire-type attack to win. He was certain Xiangzi expected him to repeat that strategy, and she'd chosen grass-type precisely to counter it. But she'd overlooked one crucial fact. Mouthflower's poison secondary type made it doubly weak to psychic techniques. Dumbbeast, Ethan snapped. Forget defense. Hit it with full, lull power, mental shock. The air crackled as Dumbbeast summoned psychic energy. Ethan was in no mood for drawn-out tactics. Rumors of trouble brewing on the ship demanded a swift victory, and he intended to end this match before the first alarm could even sound. Paralysis powder, go! Xiangzi barked, urging his stubborn elven blossom to unleash its toxin. At higher levels, these blossoms learn 3 powder moves. If mastered and timed right, they can be devastating, but the bloom hadn't practiced spitting its powder enough. It was far too slow. Before the toxin even cleared its mouth, Ethan's creature struck with psychic shock, twice in rapid succession. Superior level, better nature, finer skill mastery, and a type advantage, it was a flawless combination. Xiangzi's flower collapsed under the onslaught. Ethan restrained the final psychic shock, though. Otherwise, the flower wouldn't have simply gone down. It would have been killed outright. Frustration flashing in his eyes, Xiangzi bit his lip and glared at Ethan's emotionless stare. Then, steeling himself, he tossed another elven ball onto the battlefield. Xiangzi didn't bother hunting for elemental advantages this time. She simply called out her strongest Pokémon, the very one that had carried her through the preliminaries, a level 5, pale green bird. It had been her first companion, BB Bird, whose unmatched aerial speed made qualifying effortless. Up you go, BB Bird, use wind, Xiangzi shouted. On the other side, Kunzi's Pokémon, known as Dumbbeast, stood its ground. The two had sparred so often that each move was second nature to both of them. Swift currents swirled around BB Bird's wings, twisting into a mini whirlpool that lunged at the beast. But Dumbbeast didn't cower. With a single command, it activated Endure and slipped into a meditative trance, perfectly shrugging off the gale's force. Moments later, Dumbbeast's eyes snapped open, calm and unscathed, as the crowd held its breath. The battle had only just begun. Ethan's command came cool and precise. Psyshock first, then anticipate the water gun and counter immediately. Bibibird narrowed its round, beady eyes as it prepared to whip up a tornado, but before it could finish, Ethan's creature had already struck, unleashing Psyshock at blinding speed. No sooner had the psychic blow landed than it followed up with an empowered water gun, catching Bibibird mid-glide. The startled bird tumbled, wings flapping helplessly, and a second water gun blast drove it crashing into the stone-strewn ground. Xiangxiangzi's face drained of color. "Bibibird, hold on! Tornado!" she cried, panic edging her voice. But with inhuman swiftness, Ethan's beast closed the distance. Its smooth, pink head, like a polished orb, rebounded off Bibibird's chest with bone-jarring force. The earth beneath them cracked and caved in, leaving Bibibird sprawled in a shallow pit of rubble, utterly defeated. Ethan gave a single nod, recalling his creature back into its sphere. He regarded Xiangxiangzi coolly. Too weak, he decided. She'd better have a stronger partner ready. Ethan stood at the edge of the training arena, watching the other trainers launch into spirited duels. Every clash of Pokémon filled the air with energy and excitement, but the moment he stepped forward, he felt that familiar pang of weakness. So many here had never faced real combat. Others roamed aimlessly through their training with no clear goal. In truth, these skirmishes hardly counted as battles at all. Nearby, Xiang lifted her tear-glazed eyes and bit her lip. Gently, she set Bibi's Pokeball aside, as if she could shield her partner from disappointment. She glanced at Ethan, searching for comforting words that wouldn't come. Unable to hold back any longer, she burst into sobs. Wah! If you enjoyed this chapter, please show your support with monthly tickets, recommendation votes, bookmarks, subscriptions, and other rewards. Chapter 236, Fabricated History. Ethan stood calmly as his opponent, Xiangxiangzi, sank to her knees. She wasn't unaccustomed to defeat. Every trainer tastes it at some point, but she had never been overwhelmed so completely, so swiftly. In most battles, you'd issue dozens of commands, swapping out Pokémon to probe weaknesses, buying time for a comeback. Even with a clear power imbalance, there was at least a shred of sportsmanship, a chance to save face. Today held none of that. On the battlefield lay her first two Pokémon, their Pokeballs abandoned at her feet. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some spectators shook their heads in sympathy, others scoffed at the one-sided spectacle. Ethan felt a faint ache behind his eyes but didn't move. He simply waited, watching Xiangxiangzi for any sign of her next challenger. Moments dragged by. Finally, the referee approached, clearing his throat. "Xiangxiangzi," he said, "please send out your third Pokémon." Xiangxiangzi huddled over, shoulders trembling. She lifted her head, tears brimming in her eyes as she met Ethan's steady gaze. A single sob escaped her lips. Trembling, she wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, then straightened her spine. "I concede," she whispered. With that, she turned away and fled the arena, leaving her remaining Pokeballs on the ground. The referee sighed softly, gathering them up as the crowd's whispers swelled once more, this time tinged with pity. Ethan didn't linger after Xiangxiangzi's concession. He strode away, alongside the lumbering creature at his side, leaving the crowd to buzz with excited chatter. A tearful girl had pressed in around him, lamenting that Xiangxiangzi was so much older and yet so thoroughly defeated by Ethan's strength. As he passed the referee's platform, Ethan caught a sideways glance at the grand prize perched in a brilliant spotlight. Even in plain view, several onlookers were surreptitiously studying it. Surely Yamato's guards were watching just as closely, determined to foil any would-be thieves. Before returning to his cabin, Ethan went looking for Elder Liu Sheng. To his surprise, he found the old man seated in the ship's restaurant, absorbed in a newspaper. Ethan slid into the chair beside him, and Liu Sheng looked up in astonishment. He'd assumed Ethan was gone for good. After that late-night outing, he hadn't seen him return from his all-night battle with the Tyrannosaurus dragon on the ship's upper deck. Ethan guided his simple-minded beast into Elder Liu Sheng's courtyard and bowed respectfully. The old man looked up from his teacup, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Why don't you leave the arena for a while and come sit with an old man?" Elder Liu Sheng invited, gesturing to the low table. Ethan returned the smile and settled onto the wooden bench beside him. His dull beast, its big round eyes brimming with innocent curiosity, leaned in to sniff the fragrant steam rising from the tea. Ethan cleared his throat. "Master Liu, I've come to learn from you. My skills at cultivating beasts are still raw. I hope you'll share some of your experience." Elder Liu Sheng sipped his tea and glanced at the creature. "Your beast is a fine specimen," he said, "but I sense you're still inexperienced." Ethan nodded eagerly. Yes, I've heard of trainers spending a fortune on high-grade energy cubes to accelerate growth. I wanted to ask, when I feed these cubes to dull beasts, is there anything special I need to watch out for? And how should I use them to make their development truly efficient? The elder set his teacup down and leaned forward, fingers steepled. There's more to it than simply feeding them the strongest cubes you can buy, he began. First, you must understand the production process, how the cubes are refined, what energies they contain, and at which purity levels. Then you'll know which grade suits your beast's current stage. Too potent too soon, and you risk overwhelming its metabolism. Too weak, and its growth stagnates. Ethan listened intently as Elder Liu Sheng outlined each step, the temperature at which energy cubes should be stored, the optimal intervals between feedings, and even the slight rotational movement that helps redistribute the cube's energy before ingestion. He spoke of tempering the beast's own energy field in sync with the cube's resonance, a technique that vastly improves absorption. By the time the afternoon sun dipped low, Ethan's notebook was filled with precise measurements, schedules, and tradecraft tips. His dull beast leaned against him contentedly, as if understanding that its future strength was now in safer hands. Ethan folded his notes carefully and stood. "Thank you, Master Liu. I'll apply everything you've taught me." The elder waved him off with a gentle chuckle. "Remember, boy, patience and balance. Master those, and you'll see results far beyond what any high-end energy cube can buy." With that, he returned to his tea, leaving Ethan with a head full of knowledge and a heart determined to make his beast stronger than ever. Elder Liu Sheng folded his newspaper with a crisp snap and studied Ethan for a long moment before taking a careful sip of tea. When he spoke, his tone was leisurely but charged with thought. He began outlining his own theories on the energy cubes harvested from dumb beasts. Over the years, he had devoted himself to studying these creatures, and even their evolved forms, so thoroughly that he understood every facet of their habits and daily lives. Ethan listened intently, then returned the favor by describing his own training methods for dumb beasts. As the young man spoke, Liu Sheng leaned forward, curiosity lighting his eyes. Ethan didn't hold back. He revealed several key steps in his energy cube manufacturing process, too. Each new detail seemed to ignite the elder's enthusiasm. By the time Ethan finished explaining the finer points of cube production, Liu Sheng was fully awake, mentally, at least, and no longer exchanging mere pleasantries. He set down his tea, fixed his gaze on Ethan's face, and took stock of the youth before him. From Ethan's height and the hint of a changing voice, it was clear he was still in his late teens. And yet, despite his young age, and the fact that he'd never served as an official alliance trainer, his strength was undeniable. What surprised Liu Sheng most was Ethan's record. To have achieved so much within the walls of his own cultivation household spoke volumes about his talent and ambition. The elder found himself grinning with genuine admiration. Clearly, this young man had far more to offer than anyone in the room had first realized. Elder Liu Sheng was no ordinary breeder. His rank far exceeded that of the typical senior breeder. As Ethan spoke, Liu Sheng quickly grasped the boy's current level of cultivation. He was astonished to realize that Ethan had already reached the intermediate breeder stage. When Liu Sheng himself had attained that rank, he'd been in his 20s and renowned as a prodigy. But Ethan was barely 15 or 16, and yet he'd advanced so rapidly, mastering a breadth of knowledge that would take most years of disciplined study to acquire. Such talent, such promise. Even Yagi, Elder Liu Sheng's attendant, found himself at a loss for words. After a thoughtful pause, Liu Sheng leaned forward and asked, "Ethan, who taught you all this?" Ethan scratched the back of his head, a sheepish grin on his face. "It's nothing magical. We have a few veteran breeders in the family, and a sizable collection of old treatises. Whenever I have a spare moment, I pore over their books. I'm not entirely sure I've interpreted everything correctly, though." Liu Sheng exchanged an impressed glance with Yanagi. At such a young age, with no formal mentor, Ethan had absorbed more than most seasoned cultivators could claim, all from dusty volumes and sheer curiosity. The elder's respect for the boy deepened, and in that silent exchange, he resolved to guide Ethan more directly, ensuring his extraordinary talent would not go to waste. After Ethan finished speaking, Liu Sheng's eyes sharpened with curiosity. "So nobody ever taught you these things?" he asked, barely containing his surprise. Ethan leaned back and let out a slow breath, as if he were recalling a distant memory. "It's not that I had no teachers. The elders who raised me always insisted I read more books. Once I'd studied enough, they'd quiz me. If I couldn't answer, back to the texts I went. They refused to let me travel or train until I passed their tests. Only after I proved myself did they finally give me leave to set out on my own." Liu Sheng frowned. "Adopted disciple of some great clan, then? But you don't give off that ancient family vibe at all. Who are these elders exactly? What are their names?" Ethan shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Honestly, I couldn't tell you their surnames if my life depended on it. I just called them Grandmaster and Old Sir. I was an orphan when they took me in. No family name, no record of birth. They treated me as their own grandson, and I never questioned it. They were my family." He'd long since accepted his own background, a parentless boy with no ties. Conveniently, the Shadow's fabricated identity decked him out with exactly the same backstory, an alliance trainer orphaned and raised by kindly strangers. Beyond that, there really wasn't much more to explain. Even the personal details on his trainer's ID had been filled in only after he passed the Alliance's evaluation tests. That earlier intel was little more than a rumor. In the Alliance, this kind of thing happens all the time. Someone turns up out of nowhere, living alone in some remote mountain forest or forgotten valley. If they pass the Alliance's basic trials, they can walk away with a standard Alliance ID. Alternatively, a few existing members can vouch for them, and the scrutiny is even lighter. After all, they're not bound by any great family line, and there are countless hidden houses still scattered across the world, keepers of ancient relics, sole heirs of once powerful clans, and the like. If the Alliance tried to vet every one of them, they'd never get any real work done. As long as your motives are pure and your character checks out, securing a regular Alliance card isn't hard. What's truly difficult is earning a top-tier ID like Ethan's, the kind that comes bundled with high monthly endorsements, recommendation credits, collection badges, subscription bonuses, reward points, and more. Chapter 37. Ready to board. 3 days have passed since Ethan set foot on the ship, and the Yamata tournament is drawing to a close. So far, there's been little drama. Ethan and his loyal beast easily cleared the round of 16, then steamrolled their quarterfinal opponents to secure a spot in the semis. In both of those matches, only the beast and one of Ethan's elves actually took the field. Such was their dominance that the rest of the team never even had to step up. Today was the semifinal, and for the first time they faced a truly formidable opponent. A battle-hardened elf nearing 30, renowned for his unyielding stamina and precise swordplay. The match tested every ounce of strength the beast could muster, but in the end, Ethan's trio, beast plus 2 elves, claimed a hard-won victory and punched their ticket to the final round. Thanks to those grueling encounters and the daily training sessions they've squeezed in between matches, the beast has just leveled up to Tier 7. Ethan's other elves are working just as hard, but none of them have quite made that breakthrough yet. With the semifinals behind them and the championship match looming, Ethan and his team are finally free to rest and to prepare for the next leg of their journey. The ship's departing soon, and it's time to board. Ethan estimated that in just 2 more days of focused training, his scorpion, with its newly enhanced barbed tail, would be fully mastered and gain another level. The Ghost Stone, too, should upgrade once it has absorbed every last trace of poisonous gas. All of his opponents in the finals so far had played right into his expectations, beginning with Jitter, the same rival he'd faced in the very first round. Jitter's fire dinosaur was impressive in raw power, but its battle techniques lagged just enough for Ethan to advance effortlessly into the second stage. Jitter's next partner, however, is no pushover, the Mosquito Prince, with lightning-fast aerial strikes. Barring any surprises, Ethan and Jitter will meet in the official quarterfinal tomorrow morning. First place wins 3 skill discs. Second place still earns the coveted Jet Flame disc. Over these past 3 days, between drills and matches, Ethan has spent most of his downtime talking with Mr. Yanagi. From the moment Ethan tentatively asked about best practices for raising a home companion, Mr. Yanagi has been quietly testing his knowledge of creature care, guiding him through every detail. Chapter 7. Concealed Strength. Neither Ethan nor Mr. Liu Sheng spoke as they walked beneath the ancient pines, but their unspoken understanding hung in the air. Mr. Liu Sheng was an alliance breeder of considerable rank, practically a senior cultivator, and Ethan, though young, had sensed it the moment they met. Yet neither wished to press the matter directly. Instead, Liu Sheng watched Ethan from the corner of his eye, testing the younger man's grasp of cultivation knowledge without a single pointed question. Ethan, fully aware of the scrutiny, deliberately kept his answers modest. He presented himself as an adept on the cusp of the intermediate level, nothing more. Every piece of information he shared came strictly from the data he'd preloaded onto his energy cube. That cube, a smooth, palm-sized orb, held a vault of data chips. Cultivation techniques, formation blueprints, alchemical recipes, and more. With a thought, Ethan could summon any fragment of that knowledge, yet he restrained himself. Revealing too much, too quickly, would ring alarm bells in any elder's mind. In the Alliance, practitioners of Ethan's apparent age rarely rose above the intermediate rank. Anyone demonstrating genuine mastery beyond that threshold would face an immediate investigation and likely a summons back to League headquarters. So Ethan kept the cube's interface silently tucked in his palm, the orb looking no different from a common talisman. Whenever Liu Sheng's gaze flickered in his direction, Ethan met it with steady composure, as though he were nothing more than an eager student. After all, discretion was the truest mark of a seasoned cultivator. Ethan's skill had now solidly reached mid-level breeder status, and Mr. Yanagi was beginning to trust him. While veteran breeders jealously guard every scrap of knowledge, alliances know that anyone able to produce exceptional offspring, like Ethan, must be valued. In Liu Sheng's eyes, Ethan was a rare prodigy, destined for training rather than politics. As a result, Ethan and Mr. Yanagi had grown comfortable enough to trade jokes, and Ethan knew that if an emergency broke out on the ship, so long as he kept things under control, he could count on Yanagi's support to fall back to safety. When today's session ended and Ethan sat down with Mr. Yanagi to chat, he felt a quiet tension. Not fear, but a sharpening readiness for whatever lay ahead. Liu Sheng had been blunt. If the opportunity arose, Ethan was to slip away from St. Anu at once. And it seemed that opportunity would present itself within the next few days. On the second day aboard the Santa Anu, Father Liu Sheng's conversation with Ethan felt pointed, even though he never named him outright. In Liu Sheng's eyes, Ethan was a rare talent. If he could be prepared now, all the better. But Ethan gave no clear answer, and the elder could only shake his head, murmuring about youthful confidence. Ethan slipped back into his cabin and sank onto the sofa. The mood on the ship had turned tense, and he wasn't the only one to notice. Even Jitter, usually so brash, had tracked him down after the skirmish to ask if he felt anything amiss. Ethan said little, but inside he feared the organization could no longer wait. If they delayed, events would spiral beyond their control, and their enemies might even uncover Father Liu Sheng's true identity. He'd tried to press Liu Sheng for more information, but the elder remained tight-lipped. His unease was well-founded. High on the Sana Anu's upper deck, Yamamoto Yamato had reached his limit. Slipping behind a concealed panel, he activated a coded transmitter and summoned the mysterious operative once more. I noticed the bloodshot rings in his eyes. Though his expression remained calm, his voice was hoarse. "We're well past the deadline," he said. "If you don't act now, I'm out. No questions." "Yamamoto, we're set to board tonight. Send me every scrap of intel you've gathered," came the reply over the comm link. "Don't give me orders. You're not in charge. Our boss will arrive any minute," Yamamoto shot back. A moment later, the screen on the videophone flickered to life. A middle-aged man's face filled the display, his tone serious but laced with amusement. "Oh, is that so, Yamamoto? I thought you might be missing me." On the top deck above us, Elder Yanagi watched the exchange, narrowing his eyes. Trouble was brewing. Yamamoto forced a tight smile. "I didn't expect the boss to handle this personally. Everything will have to be foolproof." His laugh was cold and hollow. With that, the screen went dark, and Yamamoto's grin vanished, replaced by a hard, determined glare. If it was just the first envoy coming to talk, Ethan could still keep the upper hand. But if the organization's leader showed up, he'd risk losing all leverage. Meanwhile, Elder Liu Sheng, who had been perched on the roof, had vanished. He tore through the cabin, hunting for any trace of Ethan, and sent him a warning. Leave now, or it'll be too late. After days of conversation, he still didn't know where Ethan actually lived. Chapter 238, Swell. A sleek submarine rose silently alongside the Santa Anu, its hull gliding out of the waves as if it had been waiting for this very moment. A hatch opened, and one by one, figures dressed in black slipped ashore, escorted by elves whose lithe forms moved almost too quickly to track. They made their way straight to the ship's stern. Below deck, in the sailors' quarters, the entire crew tumbled out of their ordinary uniforms. Each man donned a crisp blue and white tunic and wound a matching turban around his head. When the last sailor stepped into line, a hush fell over the compartment as they snapped to attention, awaiting the arrival of their commander. Up on the main deck, the Santa Anu lurched to a sudden stop. Down below, bunks creaked and feet thumped against the wood as the sleeping sailors bolted upright. Questions rippled through the ship. Why had they halted? What threat lurked in the deep? In the officer's lounge, Ethan stirred on the sofa, the eerie stillness alerting him before the sailor's alarm. He rose, brushing sleep from his eyes. "They've arrived," he murmured, slipping on the long black coat he always kept at hand. His instincts told him to flee immediately, but Ethan had one final duty. Earlier, he'd entrusted the secret coordinates for the dormant artifact, a creature of untold power, to a discreet podium deep within the hold. Guards had once stood watch over it, but now that the rival organization was mobilizing, even those unfamiliar with the Yamamoto family's legacy eyed the prize as if it were mere treasure. Ethan drew a steady breath. The real challenge was about to begin. Ethan paused in the dim corridor of the Santa Anu, weighing his options. If the guards stayed alert, he wouldn't risk sticking around. He'd slip away with the creature, pointless though their partnership sometimes felt. But if security let its guard down, he could just as easily claim the reward that was rightfully his. He'd learned the hard way never to bet on luck twice. With a sudden surge of confidence, Ethan raised his fist and slammed it against the fire alarm in the nearby cabin. The metal housing gave way with a crack, and the piercing klaxon erupted through every corridor, cabin, and passage of the vessel. Moments later, red fire lights blinked along the walls, turning the polished decks into a scene of controlled chaos. Passengers who'd been dozing shot out of their staterooms, robes and pajamas flapping as they hurried toward the stairwells. Crew members shouted into their radios, scrambling to guide everyone to safety. Even those who had only begun to suspect something odd about the voyage now poured into the hallways, eyes wide with alarm. Above deck, Yamamoto Yama paused in his ascent toward the gangway, his features tightening into a scowl. His associates, the armed operatives he'd arranged to have quietly board the Santa Anu, were already clambering up the rope ladders. Everything had to go according to plan. Once everyone was in position, a single signal would bring the ship to its knees. But now, with alarm bells shrieking and fire teams flooding the decks, every element of his carefully laid scheme was unraveling. A petty sabotage? Perhaps. Yet for Yamamoto, it was enough to send his strategy and his patience up in flames. Ethan flung the glass in his hand to the floor, shards skittered across the carpet, and yanked open the drawer. He strapped 4 elven daggers to his belt, then snatched up the wireless handset. "Shoot Lao Tzu! Leave no one alive! Capture them all!" he roared. Flanked by 2 burly bodyguards and the young woman who'd stayed at his side, Ethan stormed out of the suite. In the hallway, a lone figure stepped forward, blocking their path. Ethan's pulse quickened as he recognized the old man, Master Liu Sheng, who'd spent days cozying up to him. But the warm smile was gone. Now Liu stood ramrod straight, his features shadowed in anger. One of the guards hesitated. He'd seen Liu Sheng many times on the ship's surveillance feeds, just an unremarkable old scholar, hardly a threat. Yet here he was, radiating authority. "You've allied yourself with the water fleet," Liu Sheng said, his voice cold and unflinching. Behind them, chaos erupted in every corridor and cabin. Panicked shouts echoed as frightened passengers stumbled over one another. A few sharp-eyed souls, however, darted past the fray toward the escape pods, already sensing that this ship's nightmare was only just beginning. Chapter Kenks, the first alarm. The moment the alarm blared through the halls of the SS Saint Anu, Alliance security sprang into action. Armed guards streamed toward the ship's central guard room, each accompanied by their summoned elves, stalwart magical sentinels meant to guarantee the safety of the cruise liner and everyone on board. But before they could lock down the perimeter, Yamamoto's faction made its move. In a swift, coordinated strike, they seized control of the guardhouse. Within minutes, every Alliance guard inside had been disarmed or neutralized, replaced by Yamamoto's agents. Word of the guardhouse's fall spread like wildfire. While some passengers panicked, a surprising few, drawn by the lure of easy money, saw opportunity. Rumor had it that the prize money from the recent Taiwan tournament was stashed somewhere aboard the St. Anu. If one could slip past the chaos, that reward could be theirs. And in times like these, people were more than willing to gamble with their lives. Ethan pushed his way through the jostling crowd, his heart pounding. He'd resolved to beat the opportunists to the punch, but as he slipped into the competition cabin where contestants clashed with their elves, the scene was worse than he'd imagined. Bodies lay crumpled on the floor, hands pressed against bleeding wounds. Their elves, drained of power, collapsed beside them like fallen statues. A handful of would-be scavengers tried to skirt the carnage, edging along the walls in hopes of finding unattended loot. Before any of them could reach the tournament vault, armed figures in sharply crested blue and white uniforms blocked the exit. They poured in from a gray submarine docked alongside the St. Anu's hull, an infiltration so clean it left no trace until now. Ethan froze when he spotted their insignia stitched above their breast pockets. It was unmistakable. The water fleet. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The first alarm had been just the beginning. Now, somewhere in these corridors, he had to find a way to outmaneuver both Yamamoto's men and the water fleet, and reach the prize before the ship became a war zone. Ethan stared in disbelief as the water fleet, one of Feng Yuan's two underground powers, revealed itself here, on this remote outpost. Its counterpart, the Fire Rocket Syndicate, was widely known. Together, the two had remained separate, like their elements suggest, fire versus water, or they might have already united to dominate the entire region. Clearly, the water fleet was no weakling. But why now? Why ambush them at the Sante Anu? Why open fire unless they intended to break free of the Alliance's pursuit? And what of Yamamoto Yamato? Could he have been playing both sides, secretly in league with the water fleet? If so, how could he still claim any allegiance to the League, or even maintain his status as clan patriarch? Ethan had no answers. With the water fleet making its battlefield debut so abruptly, the three coveted prizes he'd been tracking were surely gone for good. There was nothing more to negotiate. Ethan turned away without another word and headed back to where the great beast stood waiting. Boom! A thunderous blast ripped through the Sante Anu's upper decks, and the shockwave rocked the entire ship. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as the corridor lights flickered and alarms began to shriek. Whatever was coming next, it was far worse than he'd imagined. Ethan stood astride the fossilized pterodactyl's broad back, his expression as cold and unyielding as the stone beneath him. Before him, Yamato, freshly ascended to the Uranus tier, with the backing of his water fleet, flanked by his two elven guardians, Haluga and Iron Lobster, bore an anxious look. Moments ago, Ethan's pterodactyl had unleashed its signature cataclysmic roar, sending both Haluga and Iron Lobster hurtling through the air. Yamato's recent breakthrough into Uranus had seemed impressive, until now. Up against a veteran cultivator of Ethan's caliber and the raw power of a prehistoric beast, even the elves' elemental affinities counted for nothing. They lay scattered on the battlefield, dazed and defeated. With a faint, amused smile, Ethan surveyed his fallen foes. "So this is what everyone calls Uranus tier?" he murmured. "It seems you've still got a lot to learn." He raised his hand, ready to command the pterodactyl's next strike, when a shadow darker than midnight tore upward from the forest floor. A sinuous, violet-black form hurtled toward Ethan like a living spear, its intent singular, to strike him down. Ethan's eyes snapped open. Heart hammering, he barked to the pterodactyl, "Evade now!" At once, the ancient creature reared and twisted midair, narrowly dodging the incoming assault. Ethan gripped the rough fossilized crest beneath him, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't risk losing his mount, not yet. Whoever had launched that unexpected attack was no ordinary opponent, and the true battle had only just begun. Chapter X: Dark Rise of the Elves. The elf who'd attacked Ethan earlier was a bat-like creature with forked wings, and astonishingly, it wielded the power of a Heaven King. It had already outmatched 2 of Yamamoto's elite elven warriors. Ethan narrowed his eyes as he watched a new figure ascend the steps beside a massive wolf dog. From the way the beast carried itself, Ethan's senior trainer instincts kicked in. This wolf dog, too, was Heaven King caliber. That meant Ethan's fossil pterosaur would be facing 4 king-tier elves in one fell swoop. "Boss!" Yamato finally blurted, his voice betraying both awe and hesitation. The newcomer halted, cast a cold look at Yamamoto, and a lethal gleam flashed in his eyes. Buoyed by such overwhelming strength, he seemed to swell with arrogant confidence, and the air around him crackled with menace. Chapter 239: A Convenient Scapegoat. Liu Sheng stared at his comm unit and muttered, "Water Fleet? Hydra Division?" The Water Fleet was a shadowy organization bent on carving out new ocean territories and overturning the human world order in the elves' favor. The Alliance only discovered their existence because they'd burrowed deep into the most resource-rich sea zones, lying in wait. With so few outright attacks, they'd escaped notice, until today. Their Hydra Division was commanded by a veteran Heavenly King-class powerhouse. Liu Sheng wasn't sure he could stand against such a figure, but regardless of his own strength, the situation had spiraled far beyond him. The Alliance had found no anomalies in the Santo Anu sector. Every move the fleet had made was strictly under the radar. Liu Sheng himself had tripped over one of their secret experiments quite by accident, disrupted their funding, and deliberately kept the Alliance in the dark. His plan was brutally straightforward: seize Dr. Yasuhiro Yamamoto, hand him over as a scourge of the Alliance, and collect the hefty bounty. On top of that, he needed to secure a handful of rare artifacts in the Fengyuan region. With both motives sharpening his resolve, he decided to strike first, before the Hydra Division even knew he existed. Chapter 12: The Water Fleet's Gamble. Liu Sheng stood at the prow of the flagship, arms folded, eyes never leaving the transport ship they'd just engaged. He had come here for one prize: a quasi-king-class trainer named Yamamoto Yamato. Until moments ago, he'd assumed Yamato was little more than a high-ranking pawn. The skirmish, however, had exposed something far more dangerous. This man possessed the power of a heavenly king. Even that revelation didn't waver Liu Sheng's resolve. He tapped his communicator. "Ethan, secure the cargo holds. In exactly 1 hour, Alliance reinforcements will arrive. Until then, the water fleet must capture every passenger aboard." A ripple of eager nods ran through the officers around him. Supplies in the cargo holds were valuable, but prisoners, especially someone of Yamato's caliber, were priceless. From the shadow of the main mast, Shui Wutong, commander of the water fleet, strolled forward with a lazy grin. He cupped a hand around his mouth and called back to Liu Sheng, "Don't get ahead of yourself, old man. We're just lending a hand here. This fleet still answers to me. Right, Yamato?" Yamato's jaw tightened. He dared not contradict Shui Wutong in front of the others, so he inclined his head, eyes flashing. "Yes, Chief." Liu Sheng's lips curled into a thin smile. He knew the Alliance reinforcements would tip the scales soon enough. Before that happened, his men would have the chance to pin down Yamato, and once they had, control of the entire vessel would be theirs. He turned back to the darkened silhouette of the transport ship. The real game was about to begin. Water Indus, commander of the water fleet, was a staunch and old-school celestial king. At his side stood 3 other celestial kings, each as powerful as himself, their combined strength rivaling even Yamamoto's. Earlier that morning, Water Indus had taken a call from one of them in person, the notorious Shui Wutong. Calmly, he'd ordered, "Stand clear, keep your men on the base." But trying to control his subordinates was like warning a pair of pigs that boiling water might scald them. They simply didn't care. It was infuriating. The water fleet's headquarters, as always, bobbed somewhere out at sea. Its exact coordinates remained a mystery unless the Alliance was willing to pour vast resources into a search, time and manpower they didn't have. Meanwhile, Liu Sheng's thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. I hope that kid can escape, he muttered under his breath. At first, Ethan hadn't fled. Liu Sheng had assumed he could protect him without fuss, but the situation had quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. Unseen and unheard, Ethan crouched on a rocky outcrop just offshore, his eyes fixed on the Waterfleet's crew as hay milled around the docks below. He studied their every move, calculating the slightest opening that would let him slip away, and live to fight another day. Once they'd boarded the Santa Anu, the men under the apparent command of the ship's captain moved with military precision, seizing every critical position. The Waterfleet, dozens of vessels bristling with crew, was caught completely off guard. As soon as the fleet's operations signal echoed through the decks, the boarding party struck. Loyal sailors were overwhelmed in moments, from the engine room deep below to the bridge at the very top. Anyone who witnessed the takeover was swiftly detained. High above the fray, Ethan made his way to the topmost tier of the grandstand, the Beast of Silence and the Spectre Stone tucked securely at his side. From this vantage point, he watched silently as prisoners were brought forward in a steady stream. A grim-faced officer carried a stack of manifests and called out each name. When a captive's identity matched the list, he was hauled aside and placed under the guard of a heavily armed attendant. More and more figures passed that checkpoint, each led away to parts unknown. As Ethan observed the process, a troubling pattern emerged. Every competitor who had distinguished himself in the Yamamoto tournament, the very few who'd performed best, had been singled out and arrested. Something about this cleanup felt far more deliberate than a simple security sweep. Ethan's mind raced as he watched the Waterfleet's operation. Were they rounding up promising trainers only to haul them back to their base and recruit them through some form of indoctrination? It made sense. None of the captives bore any distinguished insignias or affiliations, just ordinary civilian trainers. The heads of powerful trainer families, even those with respectable battle records, had escaped this dragnet. The Waterfleet clearly didn't want to provoke an immediate backlash by snatching high-profile targets. After all, a handful of influential families, if united, could easily pressure the Alliance into retaliating. Such a confrontation would force the Alliance's hand. Either they'd have to crush the Waterfleet or risk looking ineffective. But by picking off random civilians instead, the Waterfleet left the Alliance free to respond only in half measures. They'd engage in a few skirmishes, suffer some casualties, and eventually back down. In the Fengyuan region, where various local powers jostle for influence, the Alliance's hands are tied unless it's willing to issue serious ultimatums. The Waterfleet exploits that paralysis mercilessly. In that context, Ethan felt a small measure of relief on behalf of his friend Jitter. At least Jitter carried official recognition as an Alliance trainer. His status would protect him from the Waterfleet's indiscriminate net. And for now, that was one less thing for Ethan to worry about. Ethan frowned as he reviewed the latest intelligence. Jitter's abilities were still unproven. Capturing a single member of the Alliance wouldn't send their entire force into a frenzy. It all came down to whether Jitter showed enough promise to lure the Waterfleet into an expedition. Ethan cared little for Jitter himself. After all, the trainer only commanded a handful of beasts, and their previous encounter had proven him no great threat. No one in their right mind would mobilize the entire Waterfleet over just a few novice trainers, Ethan murmured to himself. His thoughts then turned to old man Liu Sheng, who still hadn't surfaced. That could only mean he was caught up in something urgent. During their last exchange, Liu Sheng had casually expressed contempt for Yamato, making it clear that Yamato's strength paled beside his own. If anyone had the power to lock down a celestial king like Liu Sheng, it had to be a master-class warrior from the Waterfleet. And the Waterfleet wasn't some fledgling gang like Team Rocket. They were only just emerging on the scene. True masters among them would be exceedingly rare. Liu Sheng himself was a veteran heavenly king, at least mid-tier, perhaps even high-tier. Whoever was holding him at bay must rank at least as an intermediate king. Could it really be that Admiral Indus of the Waterfleet had already made his move? Ethan stood on the deck, replaying every detail in his mind. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The so-called civilian trainers manning the Waterfleet were nothing more than a cover. The real power on this ship lay with hidden masters, heaven-rank experts who quietly controlled the outcome of every engagement, and whatever or whoever they were protecting was undoubtedly stashed away until those masters decided the battle was won or lost. He'd almost abandoned the idea altogether, but now a spark lit behind his eyes. Someone like Yamamoto Yamada would never entrust the most valuable object or person to a mere lackey. He'd keep it close at hand, hidden in his own quarters, or even on his person, where no one could touch it. That realization crystallized Ethan's plan. He needed to draw a handful of these elite warriors out into the open, trigger the moment they let their guard down, and seize his target then and there. With that strategy taking shape in his mind, he felt hope stirring once more. Chapter 240, Facing the Big Dogs Again. Midnight at Santa Ana Summit. Ethan stood on the jagged ridge, his gaze locked on the aerial battlefield above. A pair of fossil pterosaurs glided through the moonlight, wings outstretched, while a fire-breathing dragon roared low beneath them. Far below, 4 Pokémon formed a tense line, Water Indus's Crobat, its forked tail flicking, the regal Arcanine, mane rippling in the wind, Yamato's Umbreon, eyes glinting in the dark, and the Iron Lobster, plated in gleaming steel. They'd been at it for over 15 minutes, each side scoring narrow victories, then slipping back. In raw numbers, Yamato and Water Indus held the edge, 4 Pokémon against Master Liu Sheng's 2. Individually, their creatures weren't on par with the Heavenly Kings at Liu's command, but sheer weight of force made them hard to drive back. Without those 2 soaring guardians, Liu's pterosaurs and dragon, cracking this defense would have been a nightmare. Still, the advantage wasn't translating into an all-out assault. The initiative lay with Liu Sheng. He dared not commit more than a glance, knowing any reckless move from Water Indus's Crobat would invite a devastating counterstrike from the high-flying duo above. So neither side would budge. They circled each other, wills locked, each hoping the other would blink first. Ethan watched, pulse thrumming, as the standoff stretched on. In the hush of the night sky, only the flapping of wings and the soft rumble of distant thunder hinted that the real battle was just beginning. Water Indus stood by as his men methodically stripped the trainer and the ship of every valuable item. At the same time, Father Liu Sheng paced nervously, waiting for the Alliance reinforcements to arrive. Their last report had made it clear it would be at least an hour before any substantial force could reach them. And even then, those would be ordinary soldiers, nowhere near the caliber of the true masters who could turn the tide. Rumor had it that the Regional Alliance commander was racing toward them at top speed. Though he'd only just entered the Uranus sector, if he arrived in time, neither Shui Wutong nor Yamamoto would escape. The Alliance was determined to capture at least one of them, to placate its furious member states. From a distance, the ongoing clashes looked brutal, lightning-fast strikes, roaring spells, and shock waves that shook the water around Santa Anu. In reality, neither side had yet unleashed its full force. These were testing engagements, displays of skill meant to intimidate. Both commanders worried that if the fighting escalated, the Santa Anu might sustain irreparable damage, or even break apart. Such a catastrophe would be unthinkable, and the Alliance had made clear it would fight the water fleet to the last breath. It should go without saying that constructing a colossal luxury cruiser like the Santa Anu demanded the backing and resources of countless powerful families. If that ship were destroyed, even without a single shot fired by the Alliance, each of those clans would be incensed and immediately dispatch their water fleets to hunt down whoever was responsible. Once their ships discovered our hideouts, we'd have nowhere left to run. For exactly that reason, neither side unleashed its full might at the outset. Both the Alliance and our faction held back, each committing only 2 elves to the fray. Enough to counter a surprise strike and preserve tactical initiative, but not enough to risk all-out war. On our end, Ethan deliberately made himself the lightning rod for enemy wrath. He ordered the so-called dumb beasts to evacuate the spectator stands in the battle arena via instant movement, then disperse throughout the Santa Anu. At each landing point, the creatures planted superpower coordinates, anchors that would allow them to teleport anywhere on the ship at Ethan's command. Of course, a few of the captain's most confidential quarters remained off-limits. Ethan wasn't foolish enough to blunder straight into a trap. He directed the beasts to materialize inside the captain's own cabin at the ship's very prow, ensuring our presence would be felt exactly where it mattered most. When Ethan listened to the Waterfleet's debriefing, he learned that as soon as the Santi Anu broke down, most of the trainers and crew had made a beeline for the captain's quarters. A handful tried the guardhouse instead, but Yamamoto Yamato had already taken command there. Everyone who showed up was arrested on the spot. The captain's quarters, by contrast, offered a different level of authority. Only those entrusted with piloting the Santi Anu, elite warriors, at least on par with high-level trainers, could enter. Their absolute loyalty to the Alliance was a non-negotiable requirement, otherwise they'd never have been given the ship's controls. In other words, heading to the captain's quarters was the safest move. Inside, Ethan knew, sat not only the captain himself, but also his closest confidants. Their individual strengths didn't match the captain's, but each was far more capable than the average sailor or Waterfleet operative. A couple had even risen to senior league trainer status, personally mentored by the captain as his chosen successors. Now, the entire group lay sealed off behind armored doors, held in place by the Waterfleet's blockade. The enemy's strength was nothing to scoff at, so the Waterfleet sailors dared not press the attack, resulting in a tense stalemate. In the end, only a Heavenly King-level warrior could tip the scales. Down below, the engine of the Sante Anu lay in ruins, courtesy of Waterfleet saboteurs posing as deckhands. Without skilled technicians, the ship would remain dead in the water for at least half a day. At the stern, the dumb beast beckoned Ethan to follow, staying close to the cab to avoid the roving patrols. Until now, it hadn't been able to teleport him aboard. Ethan lacked the proper clearance, and the creature didn't possess the bridge's spatial coordinates. But with the vessel drifting so near, an immediate jump was possible. After a brief pause to collect itself, the beast relaxed. Ethan slipped on the spare mask it offered, and in the blink of an eye, they vanished, reappearing inside the bridge just as two guards strode past the doorway. Ethan slipped into the chamber just as the tension inside snapped tight. Dozens of elves stood at the ready, their trainer hovering on the brink of giving the attack command. At the first sign of a new arrival, their hands twitched toward weapons, or toward whatever innate abilities elves wield these days. Ethan raised both hands above his head, clutching his Alliance ID card. Every eye in the room fixated on him. For a moment, it felt like the world had gone silent, until one voice cut through the hush. "Ethan, you made it!" A veteran Alliance trainer, breathless from racing down the corridor, dashed forward and snatched the ID from Ethan's fingers. He studied it, then looked back with relief. "Thank the gods, you're unharmed." Before Ethan could respond, a familiar chirrup echoed overhead. In a flurry of wings and fur, Jit, the jittery, bat-eared scout Ethan had befriended, swooped in. Startled, Jit misjudged his landing, careening into the wall with a sickening crack. He shook his head dazedly, then blinked at Ethan with wide, anxious eyes. "The captain's coming," murmured one of the elves, stepping aside to clear a path. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s advanced through the open doorway. His dark uniform bore the Union's Eagle and Star badge over the heart. Every step he took was measured, his gaze was flat, assessing. At the room's edge, he halted and regarded Ethan with thinly veiled suspicion. Ethan swallowed hard, holding up the ID again, as if it might somehow speak for him. The captain's eyes flicked to it, then back to Ethan's face. Though the card proved his status, the captain's stare showed he wasn't fully convinced. Jit, now recovered, let out an anxious squeak and perched on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan forced a calm smile. His official papers might keep the Elves at bay, but winning over this captain would require a little more than ink and seals. Jite scrambled to his feet, brushing off dirt as he shot a sidelong glance at the stunned beasts lingering around Ethan. Rubbing his reddened forehead, he cracked a grin at his uncle. "See, Uncle? This is Ethan, the one I've been telling you about. Not only is he powerful, but he's incredibly knowledgeable. Even more impressive up close." Jite's tone was brimming with admiration. Ethan, however, stood frozen in surprise. The man before him, clearly the mighty Captain Santanu, was actually Jite's uncle? Ethan's jaw dropped. Another unexpected twist in an already astonishing evening.